Behind the doors of an ordinary home, a boy carried a secret too dark for childhood. A secret whispered in silence, buried in fear, and bound by blood. This is not just a crime. It's a battle for truth, survival, and the courage to shatter silence. There are moments in life that split time in two, before and after. For Duncan Fairhurst, that moment came not in a courtroom, nor in the middle of a headline-grabbing revelation, but on an ordinary street on an ordinary day in a quiet English town. He was walking, just another face in the crowd, when he saw him, the man who had shaped his childhood in the most twisted, damaging way possible. His father. He wasn't alone. At his side was a boy, maybe 5 years old, dark-haired, small, skipping to keep up with the old man's stride. To anyone else, they looked like family, a grandfatherly figure taking his grandson for a stroll. To Duncan, the sight hit like a knife. He knew what that smile meant, the one plastered across his father's face. He had seen it before, when he was the boy, when he was the one holding that hand. A wave of rage surged through him. For years, he had rehearsed this encounter in his mind. What he would say, how he would scream at him, how he might even kill him given the chance. But at that moment, standing just a few feet away, Duncan froze. Because he saw the boy, innocent, vulnerable, carrying no clue of the man's true nature. Duncan knew he couldn't act. The child didn't deserve to witness violence, not even against the man who deserved it. So he let his father pass. They brushed shoulders, close enough for recognition, close enough for every memory to come flooding back. Duncan's skin prickled with hatred, but he said nothing. He did nothing. He watched them fade into the crowd. And then he understood something that changed everything. His silence wasn't just about his own survival anymore. There were other children, perhaps this boy, who could become what he once was. And that realization forced him to face what he had been running from his entire life. That moment, brief, fleeting, was the start of an entirely different journey. One that would see him break the silence, walk into a police station, and name his own father as his abuser. It was the beginning of a battle for justice, not only for himself but for every child who might otherwise be caught in the same cycle. But to understand how Duncan reached that point, we have to go back. Back to the beginning. Duncan Fairhurst was born in 1970 in Northamptonshire, England, into what, on the surface, seemed an ordinary family. His mother, once a nurse, was strict, practical, and frugal, running the household with an iron grip on the purse strings. His father, Clifford, was larger than life in Duncan's eyes. To a little boy, he seemed strong, clever, even heroic. He answered questions with authority, bailed him out when his mother's punishments were too harsh, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made a child think, "That's my dad, the strongest man in the world." But behind the walls of their modest home, things were not what they seemed. Duncan's earliest memories are colored by contradictions. There were pets, cats, dogs, even hamsters, filling the house with life. There were ordinary childhood games, playing in the garden, wandering down alleys to visit friends. There were even holidays in a caravan by the sea, complete with family walks and ice cream treats. Yet, woven through these ordinary snapshots were shadows Duncan didn't yet understand. Nightmares came early. Strange, frightening dreams of masked figures, endless corridors, of being chased and cornered. He would wake in the night trembling, calling for comfort. Sometimes his mother came, sometimes his father. They would mutter the usual reassurance, "It's only a dream," before shutting the door again. He was left alone in the dark, heart racing, mind unsettled. Even then, fear was already a companion. And then there was the illness. At just 5 years old, Duncan woke one morning covered in bruises, fingerprint-shaped marks all over his body. His parents rushed him to hospital, terrified it was leukemia. It wasn't, but the truth was still serious. A rare blood disorder that left him vulnerable to internal bleeding. He spent Christmas in an oxygen tent, isolated from touch, from hugs, from the warmth every child craves. He listened to the radio play money, money, money on repeat and stared at gifts he wasn't allowed to open. The memory of separation, of being watched and examined but never comforted, would stay with him. In a way, it prepared him for what was to come, the feeling of being alone, of being set apart from everyone else, even when surrounded by family. The Fairhurst household had its routines. His mother believed in strict order, penny pinching, and discipline. His sister Johanna, for years older, could be both companion and tormentor. His father was different. He was affectionate, playful even, in ways that seemed to set him apart from Duncan's stern mother. At first, that felt like a gift. Dad was the one who let him off the hook, who made things feel lighter. But gradually, that affection began to twist into something else. Something Duncan couldn't name as a child, but that would define his entire future. It began with bath time. On the surface, sharing baths wasn't unusual. It was the 1970s. Families cut corners, children bathed together, parents joined them. It was seen as practical. But Clifford began to carve out these moments as his territory. He was always the one to bathe Duncan, always the one to help with washing, even when Duncan was old enough to do it himself. Always the one to linger when others had moved on. The first time it crossed the line, Duncan didn't even realize. He was too young. His father had framed it as normal, as loving. A game, a bond between father and son. "This is what daddies and boys do when they love each other," Clifford told him. To a child desperate for approval, for that fatherly affection, how could he know any different? It wasn't terror at first, it was confusion, then discomfort, then the sense that something was deeply wrong, even if he couldn't articulate it. The worst crime Clifford committed was not just in the acts themselves, but in convincing his son that they were normal. That secrecy was part of love. That silence was safety. And so, Duncan carried the weight of something he couldn't name, something that isolated him from other children. At school, kids bragged about their fathers, the adventures, the freedom, even the occasional mischief. But never, not once, did a boy say what Duncan was experiencing. That silence told him everything. Whatever was happening in his home, it wasn't normal. It was his burden to carry. As the years went by, the abuse became routine, part of everyday life. Clifford turned it into ritual, into obligation. Duncan estimates that over the years, he was forced to sexually service his father more than 1,500 times. Numbers so high they blur into habit, stripping away the idea of incident or event. It wasn't a one-off. It wasn't occasional. It was life. And yet, to the outside world, Duncan was just another boy, going to school, playing with friends, enduring sibling rivalries, living in a house with pets and Sunday dinners. The facade was intact. His father even wore it with pride, presenting himself as a devoted parent. That was part of the horror, how ordinary it all looked from the outside. But inside, Duncan was already breaking. This is where the story of survival begins. Not at the police station years later, but in the quiet resilience of a child trying to navigate two realities. The world that everyone saw, and the world he endured alone. His nightmares continued. His trust eroded. His body became a battlefield, both his own and not his own. And yet somehow he carried on. Because that's what children do. They survive. They adapt. They find ways to keep going, even when the world they're trapped in is unthinkable. And for Duncan, survival meant silence. For now, the atmosphere of the Fairhurst home carried contradictions Duncan could never quite reconcile. On one hand, there were pets curling in warm corners, family meals around the table, and the illusion of stability. On the other, there was tension, an undercurrent of bickering between his parents that seemed constant, endless, wearing. His mother, sharp-eyed and controlling, ran the household with thrift and criticism. His father, louder and more relaxed on the surface, often disappeared into work or excuses of late nights, returning when it suited him. To the neighbors, they were simply another working-class family in England. Nothing stood out. No one suspected. And that was the shield Clifford relied on. Predators thrive in normality. They depend on the mask of everyday life. For Duncan, bath time remained the crucible. It was there that his father taught him confusion, shame, and silence. Clifford built a twisted logic around his abuse. He told his son that this was love, that it was private, that it was what good fathers did with their boys. And he cemented it with a phrase Duncan would never forget. Our little secret. Those words became chains. Every time Duncan thought of telling someone, a teacher, a relative, even his mother, he heard that reminder. If anyone found out, his father would go to prison. The lie was reinforced with comparisons. Clifford insisting that every father did this, they just didn't admit it. That secrecy was normal. That punishment would be unfair. For a child desperate to keep his father, terrified of abandonment, the warning stuck. So Duncan kept quiet. School became both refuge and battlefield. Like most children, he quickly realized that survival depended on blending in. Don't be too different, don't stand out, don't reveal weakness. The playground was a stage where toughness mattered more than truth. And Duncan learned how to play the part. He laughed at crude jokes. He joined in the bravado. He pretended to understand the talk about girlfriends, about sneaking cigarettes, about mischief. But there was one subject that never came up, one experience no boy ever confessed. That silence told Duncan that his home life wasn't normal, no matter what his father said. And that gap between what he lived and what his peers talked about widened into isolation. He carried the weight of knowledge no child should carry. He carried it quietly, hidden beneath the surface, while outwardly he remained another schoolboy. The abuse was not isolated moments but routine, ritualized. Clifford ensured it continued, embedding it into everyday life. Duncan learned to dread bath time, to read the signs, to anticipate what was coming. It wasn't terror every time. That was perhaps the cruelest part. After a while, it became mechanical, expected, something to get through. Clifford had normalized the unthinkable. But Duncan's mind couldn't ignore the unease. He started to feel split in two. There was the boy who played football with friends, who laughed at silly jokes, who loved his pets. And there was the boy who endured his father's secret, who lay awake at night with racing thoughts, who suffered nightmares that felt endless. The child who wanted to belong and the child who was trapped in silence were one and the same. That fracture would widen as the years went on. And yet, amidst all of this, Duncan still loved his father. That is one of the hardest truths for survivors to explain. Love and abuse can coexist in the same space when the abuser is family. Clifford wasn't only a predator. He was also the man who took Duncan swimming, who let him off the hook when his mother scolded him, who seemed to understand him in ways others didn't. That duality is devastating. It makes betrayal deeper. It makes silence harder. How could Duncan hate the same man he loved? How could he condemn the father who held his hand at the seaside, who laughed with him, who bought him treats, while also fearing the man who violated him? That confusion is what kept Duncan silent year after year. The first part of this story belongs to that silence. It belongs to the boy who tried to reconcile love and fear, who learned to smile at school while dreading home, who endured things he couldn't name. It belongs to the child who held on because survival was the only option. And survival meant secrecy. For now, childhood, in theory, is meant to be a sanctuary of innocence, a time of laughter, scraped knees, and simple joys. But for Duncan, innocence was not something he was allowed to keep. Instead, he lived in two worlds: the outer world of schoolyards and Sunday dinners, and the inner world of secrets that gnawed at him from within. By the late 1970s, Duncan was beginning to recognize patterns in his home. His mother's sharp frugality defined much of the household atmosphere. Every penny was counted, every indulgence scrutinized. She could be tender when he was ill, but she was also prone to cutting words and cold stares. His sister Johanna, older and emboldened, often framed him for mischief. And his father remained both protector and tormentor, the contradiction that would define Duncan's life. There were still fragments of ordinary joy. Family pets softened the edges of an otherwise tense home. Cats perched on boilers, dogs sprawled in hallways, gerbils scurried in cages. Duncan remembers their warmth, their unconditional presence. They didn't ask questions. They didn't demand explanations. In a house where affection was often conditional and laced with hidden dangers, the animals became silent companions. But those brief comforts could not erase the dread that built each evening. Bath time became ritual, not of cleansing but of corruption. Clifford used it as cover, the perfect disguise. To outsiders, a father bathing his son seemed unremarkable. To Duncan, it became the stage where his body was no longer his own. Clifford blurred lines until they vanished entirely. He told Duncan this was love. He told him it was normal. He told him it was theirs alone to keep. And Duncan, too young to argue, absorbed the lies. At school, Duncan studied the faces of other boys, searching for signs. Were they hiding something too? Did their fathers demand the same secrets? No one ever said a word. They joked about girlfriends, about sneaking dirty magazines, about awkward first kisses. But never, not once, did anyone describe what Duncan endured. That silence confirmed what he already suspected. He was alone. Loneliness seeped into him like a shadow. He learned to wear masks of his own, laughing when expected, staying quiet when safer. He kept his head down, blending in. But inside, a storm raged. The weight of silence pressed down with every passing year. And yet, he still loved his father. That contradiction is one of abuse's cruelest tricks. Clifford wasn't only an abuser. He was also the man who took Duncan fishing, who treated him to days out, who seemed to offer approval when no one else did. That duality carved confusion into Duncan's heart. How do you hate the same man who praises you, who comforts you, who tells you he loves you? Clifford weaponized that confusion, making himself both captor and savior in his son's mind. The nightmares grew worse. Some were absurd, cartoonish creatures tugging at his nose, corridors that stretched into infinity. Others were darker, filled with faceless pursuers and shadows he couldn't escape. He would wake sweating, heart racing, desperate for comfort. Sometimes his mother came, muttering, "It's only a dream," before leaving him alone again. Sometimes it was Clifford, whose presence brought no comfort at all. In the dark, Duncan felt the weight of fear pressing in from all sides. Fear became a constant companion. Fear of night, fear of bath time, fear of speaking out. It wove itself into the fabric of his childhood until it became indistinguishable from daily life. But children adapt. Duncan found small refuges, lying on the landing at night to watch car headlights slip under the blinds, losing himself in games with friends, immersing himself in the company of pets. Survival meant clinging to these fragments of light wherever they appeared. Looking back, Duncan would one day describe the abuse not as isolated horrors but as routine, something as ordinary in his young mind as brushing teeth or going to school. That normalization was Clifford's greatest crime. He robbed his son not only of safety, but of the very framework to recognize wrong from right. By the time Duncan realized what was happening, he was already deep inside the cycle. Silence had become second nature. His father's warnings echoed. If anyone found out, he'd go to prison. And worse, Duncan was told it would be his fault. That guilt silenced him more than fear ever could. So he carried it alone. This is where Duncan's story truly begins. Not in the police station decades later, not in the courtroom where his father was finally unmasked, but here, in the quiet despair of a boy who wanted to love his family, who wanted to belong, who wanted to believe he was safe. He wasn't safe, but he survived. And survival for Duncan meant silence. For now, the house on Dorothy Avenue, Melton Mowbray, became the stage for much of Duncan's childhood. From the outside, it looked perfectly ordinary. A neat garden, friendly neighbors, a family that seemed like any other. But behind closed doors, Duncan learned lessons most children never should. His mother's thrift defined much of the daily rhythm. She monitored every coin, every light left on, every unnecessary indulgence. To save money, baths were shared. His mother with his sister, his father with him. What neighbors might have dismissed as old-fashioned frugality became, for Duncan, the arena of abuse. The script rarely changed. His father would initiate with the same soft tone, disguising demand as care. He would call it a flick, reducing the unspeakable to a childlike word. He would praise Duncan's compliance as love. He would warn that discovery meant prison, not for him but because Duncan had betrayed him. The manipulation was calculated, relentless, and Duncan, still too young to name the horror, complied. Not because he wanted to, not because he didn't understand wrong from right, but because Clifford had built a world where silence seemed safer than truth. But even in that shadowed world, Duncan searched for light. He loved the pets. He adored the family's Siamese cat, Yowli, who would trot alongside them on seaside walks, curling around shoulders like a scarf. Yowli didn't judge. Yowli didn't demand silence. For a boy whose trust was already broken, the cat's simple companionship was a balm. Friendships at school gave him another outlet. He wasn't the loudest boy, but he wasn't invisible either. He laughed at the same jokes, joined the same games, learned how to blend in. That camouflage was survival, kept suspicion away. It gave him a sliver of normality. Still, Duncan sensed the cracks. When boys bragged about adventures with their fathers, driving cars, sneaking drinks, sharing jokes, Duncan fell silent. He couldn't brag about his adventures. He couldn't confess the reality of bath times. That silence marked him, even if no one else noticed. The Fairhurst family itself was marked by contradiction. His mother, though stern, could also be nurturing. When Duncan was gravely ill as a child, quarantined in an oxygen tent, she never faltered in her care. Yet she also turned her sharp tongue on him at the slightest perceived rudeness. She could nurse him through sickness and yet scold him for calling a neighbor Pat instead of Auntie Pat. That duality left Duncan constantly guessing which version of her he would face. His father, meanwhile, was outwardly charismatic. To relatives and neighbors, Clifford was approachable, generous, even entertaining. He carried himself with a kind of pride, as though he were the anchor of the family. To Duncan, that mask made the abuse even harder to reconcile. How could this admired man be the same one who demanded silence in the bathroom? The dissonance carved confusion deep into his heart. As Duncan grew, the sense of unease sharpened. He didn't have the language for it, but instinct told him something was wrong. He began to dread moments alone with his father. He would cling to his mother's coat, beg to join her and his sister on day trips rather than be left at home. But his protests were dismissed as childish fussing. No one realized what he was really trying to escape. That helplessness, of begging to be spared without being able to say why, etched itself into his memory. He remembers the door shutting, the sound of his mother and sister leaving, and the creeping dread of being left behind. Even before anything happened, fear was already there, crouched in the silence, waiting. The cycle repeated, and with each repetition, Duncan learned that resistance was useless. His father's authority was absolute. His words twisted truth into lies, turning abuse into love, secrecy into safety. Each time Duncan complied, a little more of his childhood slipped away. The emotional toll began to show in other ways. Nightmares stalked him. He would wake sweating, trembling, sometimes crying. He would lie on the landing, staring at the glow of passing headlights, finding comfort in patterns of light rather than the people meant to protect him. The outside world became his lullaby. His relationship with his sister, Johanna, offered little refuge. She often mocked him, manipulated situations to her advantage, even framed him for her mischief. Once, she scrawled lipstick across their parents' bedspread and blamed Duncan. He was beaten for it. Another time, she poured perfume across the same bed and pointed the finger at him again. He learned that truth carried no weight in his home. Accusation did. And in that imbalance, trust with his sister fractured. The lack of allies deepened Duncan's isolation. Home wasn't safe. School wasn't a place to speak. His sister wasn't someone he could confide in. So he carried it all silently, layer upon layer, the weight pressing harder each year. Yet, amid that silence, a seed of rebellion began to stir. Duncan couldn't name it then, but something in him resisted the idea that this was normal. Maybe it was hearing boys at school talk about their fathers with laughter rather than dread. Maybe it was the gnawing guilt that never really left after each secret. Maybe it was the instinct all children have, the quiet voice that whispers when something is wrong. Whatever the reason, that seed mattered. It was the beginning of the long journey that would one day bring Duncan to a police station, to a courtroom, to justice. It was faint, fragile, easily drowned out by fear, but it was there. And though he couldn't act on it yet, that spark of resistance would prove to be the difference between silence forever and survival with a voice. The first installment of this story belongs to the child Duncan was. A boy caught between love and fear, between secrecy and survival, between innocence and betrayal. It belongs to the ordinary days that masked extraordinary pain. It belongs to the silence that shaped him, silence he carried for decades before he finally broke it. This is where the story begins. In the quiet streets of England, in an ordinary house, in the fragile heart of a boy who wanted to be safe, who wanted to be loved, and who would one day find the strength to expose the truth. Evenings in the Fairhurst home often followed the same pattern. His mother prepared meals with precision, but dinner was rarely peaceful. Small sparks, the wrong wooden spoon used, food served too late, a forgotten detail, ignited arguments that flared across the table. Duncan and Johanna sat silently, forks poised, as voices rose and plates clattered. To outsiders, Sunday roasts were family bonding. To Duncan, they were minefields. Food itself carried tension. He hated Brussels sprouts but was forced to eat them, gagging, sometimes vomiting. His mother insisted obedience meant finishing everything on the plate. The message was clear. Discomfort didn't matter, resistance was pointless, and his voice carried no weight. That lesson, learned at the table, echoed in darker corners of the house. And yet, when visitors came, the atmosphere transformed. His parents became model hosts, smiling, polite, gracious. The arguments evaporated, the tensions concealed. Duncan watched in silence, bewildered by the performance. It was a mask, the same kind his father wore when he stepped into the role of proud parent. The mask of normality was impenetrable to outsiders. Behind it, truth rotted in silence. At school, Duncan carried the same mask. He smiled at jokes, joined in games, kept his head down when teasing turned sharp. He learned the art of invisibility, blending enough to be part of the crowd, quiet enough to avoid attention. Teachers never asked questions. Friends never noticed. Silence was camouflage. Inside, however, the cost grew heavier. The nightmares became more vivid. The confusion deepened. And the seed of resistance, though still faint, pushed roots into the soil of his mind. By the time he was 8, Duncan understood more than most children ever should. He knew that love could wound. He knew that family could betray. He knew that silence was sometimes safer than truth. And yet, he also sensed, without being able to name it, that one day he would have to choose differently. That choice wasn't possible yet. He was still too small, too frightened, too bound by the chains his father had wrapped around him. But survival has its own logic. Children find ways to endure until they can resist. Duncan's way was silence, compliance, masking his pain behind the appearance of normal life. But beneath the silence, a spark remained. The instinct that this wasn't normal. The faint hope that one day he would break free. Looking back years later, Duncan would describe those early years as stolen. A childhood hijacked by manipulation and fear. He would recall the moments of joy, pets, seaside trips, laughter with friends, but always filtered through the shadow of secrecy. Every memory, even the happy ones, was tainted by the knowledge of what lay hidden beneath. And yet, those early years mattered. They were the foundation on which his survival was built. They were the crucible where silence hardened into endurance. They were the beginning of a journey that would stretch across decades, through addiction, despair, and eventually justice. This is where his story begins. Not in a courtroom, not in headlines, but in the quiet corridors of childhood. In bath times that weren't innocent. In nightmares that weren't imagined. In the silence of a boy who carried too much too soon. Duncan Fairhurst was just a child. But his story was already being written in the shadows. And though he couldn't see it then, the day would come when he would find his voice. That day was still far away. For now, there was only silence. By the time Duncan entered his later childhood, silence had become second nature. He knew the rules of survival. Don't question, don't resist, don't speak. The abuse was no longer a shocking intrusion. It had been normalized into the rhythm of life. Like brushing teeth, like bedtime routines, it simply happened. And that was perhaps the most devastating part. Clifford had succeeded in reshaping his son's reality. What should have been a sanctuary, bath time, quiet evenings, moments between father and son, were instead repurposed into rituals of control. Clifford called it love, disguising violation beneath the language of care. He framed it as their secret, cementing Duncan's silence with fear of consequences. The boy complied, but he was not blind. With each passing year, his awareness sharpened. He began to notice differences. Other children spoke of their fathers with admiration, sometimes frustration, but never with the dread Duncan carried. They told stories of football matches, fishing trips, adventures in cars. Duncan listened, smiling, nodding, pretending he had stories too. Inside, though, he knew his reality was different. That knowledge carved isolation deep into him. School was both refuge and battlefield. On one hand, it provided escape from home, a place where Clifford had no reach during the day. On the other, it was an arena of constant performance. Duncan learned to mimic normality, to laugh at jokes he didn't find funny, to hide the weight he carried. Children can be merciless, and Duncan knew instinctively that standing out in any way meant risk. So he blended. But even as he blended, his body betrayed him. The stress of secrecy, the toll of nightmares, the constant dread etched itself into his posture, his expressions. Teachers might have noticed had they looked closely. But in the 1970s and 80s, few were trained to recognize the signs of abuse. Duncan was quiet, polite, seemingly well cared for. On paper, nothing stood out, and so the silence held. At home, the mask of normality persisted. His mother busied herself with thrift and order. His sister continued to mock, to frame him for mischief, deepening his sense of isolation. Clifford carried on as the outwardly respectable father, working, socializing, carrying himself with pride. To outsiders, the Fairhursts were unremarkable. But Duncan knew better. He knew the rituals. He knew the locked bathroom doors, the coded words, the lies dressed as love. He knew that behind every smile, every friendly exchange, his father carried a darkness no one else could see. Holidays offered no escape. The caravan trips to Trusthorpe, which might have been joyful memories, carried their own shadows. Shared showers at the campsite became extensions of the same abuse, disguised as practical necessity. Clifford found opportunity in every circumstance, ensuring that even away from home, the cycle continued. For Duncan, the beach, the arcades, the ice cream cones, all were tinged with the dread of what came after. Childhood joys were never untainted. They were always paired with fear, always shadowed by the knowledge of what awaited when the fun ended. As Duncan entered adolescence, changes in his body complicated everything further. Puberty arrived with confusion, embarrassment, and shame, natural for any boy, but magnified for one whose body had already been weaponized against him. Clifford exploited the changes, weaving them into his narrative. "This is normal," he insisted. "This is what fathers and sons do." But Duncan wasn't a child anymore. His mind, sharper now, began to question. Doubt crept in, small but relentless. If this is normal, why does no one else talk about it? If this is love, why does it feel like fear? The questions were dangerous, not to Clifford, but to Duncan's fragile equilibrium. To survive, he had to keep them buried. Speaking them aloud would risk shattering the careful balance he had built. So he pushed them down, carrying them in silence. The psychological toll grew heavier. Nightmares became darker. Fear translated into anxiety, restlessness, a sense of never being safe. Duncan began to develop coping mechanisms. He found solace in pets, whose presence offered unconditional comfort. He clung to friendships, even shallow ones, for the illusion of normality. He immersed himself in the noise of everyday life to drown out the silence of his secrets. But coping was not healing. It was survival, and survival came at a cost. By his early teens, Duncan was caught between two worlds, the child who complied and the adolescent who questioned. The split widened each year. His father's control was strong, but cracks were beginning to show. Resistance stirred, faint but undeniable. He didn't act on it yet. He wasn't ready, but deep inside he knew a reckoning would come. And when it did, it would change everything. Adolescence is difficult for any child. Bodies change, emotions sharpen, identities take shape. For Duncan, those years carried the usual awkwardness of puberty layered with the crushing weight of silence. While classmates giggled about crushes or whispered about first kisses, Duncan was living a double life. Outwardly, he was just another boy navigating teenage years. Inwardly, he was enduring something he couldn't name. The abuse had become routine, almost mechanical. Clifford no longer needed elaborate excuses. The bathroom door closing, a shower running, a moment alone was enough. The rituals had been established. Duncan complied not because he wanted to, but because resistance seemed impossible. The cost of saying no felt too high. Yet, even as the routine continued, Duncan's awareness deepened. He no longer believed Clifford's words entirely. He began to see the cracks in the lies. If this was truly normal, why did he never hear anyone else mention it? If this was love, why did it leave him feeling dirty, ashamed, and afraid? The questions gnawed at him. He learned to carry those questions in silence, but they began to shape his perception of the world. At school, he studied his peers more closely. He listened carefully to their stories about family life, testing them against his own. He realized more and more how different he was. That difference became another weight, isolating him further. But Duncan was resourceful. To mask the isolation, he perfected the art of pretending. He laughed when expected, joined in conversations, nodded at jokes. He became a chameleon, blending into the crowd while carrying a secret no one else could see. At night, though, the mask slipped. Nightmares stalked him relentlessly. He would wake sweating, heart pounding, convinced shadows in the room were alive. He would lie awake, replaying the day's rituals, replaying his father's words, trying to make sense of them. Sleep was no refuge, it was another battlefield. There were moments of light even then. Pets remained a constant source of comfort. Yowli the cat, with his calm presence, provided the unconditional love that humans failed to give. Duncan cherished those moments, stroking soft fur, listening to purrs, feeling a warmth that wasn't corrupted by hidden demands. Friends, too, offered temporary escape. Playing football, hanging out in the park, riding bikes. These moments reminded Duncan what childhood was supposed to feel like. But the shadow was always there. Laughter could be genuine in the moment, yet behind it lay the knowledge of what awaited at home. Clifford's control extended beyond the physical. He manipulated Duncan's emotions with surgical precision. After abuse, he would often act tender, stroking his son's hair, praising him. He blurred boundaries, making Duncan feel complicit in his own victimization. "You do love Daddy, don't you?" he would say, turning violation into proof of affection. For a boy desperate to be loved, the manipulation was devastating. This emotional entanglement is one of the cruelest aspects of familial abuse. Victims are forced to reconcile love and betrayal, care and fear, affection and violation. For Duncan, it meant carrying guilt alongside trauma. He felt responsible for keeping the secret, for protecting his father, even as he was being destroyed. As Duncan grew older, he began to seek small forms of rebellion. They were not direct confrontations. He was still too frightened for that, but subtle acts of resistance. Staying out later than allowed, testing boundaries at school, lying about where he had been. To outsiders, these looked like normal teenage misbehaviors. To Duncan, they were attempts to reclaim slivers of control. But even rebellion carried danger. Any misstep risked drawing Clifford's anger, which could make the abuse harsher, more controlling. Duncan learned to measure his defiance carefully, testing limits without crossing lines too far. Survival remained the priority. The toll on his self-image was profound. He struggled with identity, unsure of who he was beyond the silence. Shame burrowed deep, convincing him he was different, damaged, unworthy. He feared discovery, not only because of his father's threats, but because he worried others would see him as complicit, as broken. These fears are common among survivors, but Duncan had no way of knowing that then. To him, the shame felt uniquely his. It became another reason to stay silent. Adolescence also brought exposure to the wider world. Music, television, glimpses of relationships. Duncan watched couples on screen, listened to love songs, and wondered if such affection could ever be real. The version of love he had been taught was twisted beyond recognition. The idea of trust, of intimacy, seemed foreign. Already, the foundation for future struggles in relationships was being laid. Yet, despite everything Duncan endured, he went to school, made friends, laughed, played, lived. That resilience is a testament to the strength of children, their ability to carry unbearable burdens and still find ways to keep going. But endurance is not healing. It is survival, and survival alone cannot last forever. By his mid-teens, Duncan knew he couldn't carry the secret indefinitely. He didn't yet know how he would break free, or when, but he felt the weight of inevitability. Silence could not be sustained forever. Something would have to give. That moment was still years away. For now, Duncan remained trapped in the cycle. Abuse, silence, shame, repetition. But the cracks were widening. Doubt was growing. Resistance was stirring. The boy who had been silenced was slowly, quietly, preparing to find his voice. By his later teens, Duncan was living in a constant state of contradiction. On the surface, he was growing into independence. Taller, stronger, forming friendships, exploring the edges of adulthood. Inside, he was still the boy carrying a secret that consumed him. That split between outer life and inner reality widened with every year. The abuse continued, though it shifted with time. Clifford adapted his tactics as Duncan aged, but the core remained the same. Control disguised as love, secrecy enforced through fear. By then, Duncan knew with absolute certainty that what was happening was wrong. But knowing and acting are two very different things. Fear held him silent. Shame sealed his lips. And so he endured. At school, Duncan appeared ordinary enough. He passed through lessons, laughed with friends, joined in the rituals of teenage life. But beneath the surface, the strain was visible to anyone who looked closely. He carried himself with tension, his eyes often shadowed by sleepless nights. Teachers missed it. Friends assumed he was just quiet, maybe shy. No one imagined the truth. The silence was reinforced by society itself. In those years, abuse was rarely discussed openly. Children were expected to respect parents unquestioningly. The idea of accusing a father, especially of something so unthinkable, was unimaginable. Duncan absorbed that cultural silence as deeply as his father's threats. Speaking out felt not only dangerous, but impossible. Home life continued in its contradictions. His mother's frugality persisted, her scolding sharp as ever. His sister drifted into her own world, leaving Duncan further isolated. Clifford carried on with his dual mask. Outwardly the provider, inwardly the predator. To visitors, the family looked normal. To Duncan, the house was a cage. Even holidays became complicated. Trips to the seaside, caravan stays, family outings. All could have been sources of joy, and there were moments Duncan cherished. Playing on the beach, laughing in arcades, eating fish and chips with the sea breeze in his hair. But those memories were always paired with dread. The laughter never lasted. Behind it, the rituals waited. Even the happiest days carried shadows. By 16, Duncan's coping mechanisms were straining. Nightmares left him exhausted. Anxiety gnawed at him. He began to withdraw more, spending time alone, avoiding conversations that might expose him. But he also sought escape. Small rebellions grew bolder, staying out later, testing limits, pushing boundaries. To his parents, it may have looked like typical teenage defiance. To Duncan, it was survival. Each act of disobedience gave him a sliver of control in a world where control was otherwise stolen. Yet the defiance never lasted. He always returned home. He always complied. The cycle held him fast. Adolescence also sharpened his awareness of relationships. Friends began dating, whispering about romance, experimenting with intimacy. For Duncan, it was disorienting. His understanding of touch, of affection, of love itself had been corrupted. He didn't know what trust looked like. He didn't know how to separate affection from exploitation. The very idea of romance felt alien. This confusion carved loneliness deeper. He longed for connection but feared it at the same time. He carried shame that made him believe no one could ever accept him. That belief, planted by his father's manipulation, would haunt him well into adulthood. By his later teens, depression began to creep in. Though he might not have used that word at the time, the symptoms were there. Exhaustion, hopelessness, a sense of worthlessness. He began to question not only his circumstances, but his very existence. Life felt like an endless loop. School, home, rituals, silence. He couldn't see a way out, and yet he endured. That endurance was both a strength and a curse. Kept him alive, but it also trapped him in silence. One of the cruelest legacies of abuse is the way it fractures identity. Duncan's sense of self was deeply damaged. He was not just a boy, not just a teenager. He was a keeper of secrets, a child forced into complicity, a survivor carrying guilt that was never his to bear. The abuse shaped not only his memories, but his very sense of who he was. Still, within that fracture, resilience simmered. He may not have believed it then, but surviving each day was itself an act of resistance. Every laugh with friends, every moment of joy with pets, every sliver of rebellion was proof that Clifford had not completely destroyed him. As Duncan approached adulthood, the gap between inner turmoil and outer life widened to the breaking point. He was on the edge of freedom from childhood, but still tethered by silence. The question of when and how he would finally speak remained unanswered. But the cracks were widening. The questions were louder. The weight of silence was becoming unbearable. He didn't yet know it, but his adolescence was the final chapter of silence. The years ahead would bring new struggles: addiction, self-destruction, despair. But they would also bring something he had never allowed himself to imagine: the possibility of breaking free. Installment 2 ends in that tension. A teenager carrying unbearable secrets, stepping into adulthood with shadows behind him and an uncertain future ahead. The silence has lasted more than a decade. But silence, no matter how heavy, cannot last forever. Adulthood was supposed to mean freedom. At least that's what Duncan believed as he edged out of his teenage years. He imagined independence would loosen the chains of childhood, that leaving home would mean leaving behind the secrets. But secrets don't stay in houses. They don't vanish with age. They follow you, weaving themselves into every choice, every thought, every relationship. For Duncan, stepping into adulthood did not erase his past. It magnified it. The silence he had carried for so long hardened into something else: self-destruction. On the surface, he was just another young man trying to find his place in the world. He worked, he socialized, he carried the same restless energy of others his age. But beneath that exterior, Duncan was unraveling. Nightmares continued, more vivid now, more insistent. Anxiety plagued him, a constant sense that danger was near even when life appeared calm. Shame seeped into everything, whispering that he was different, broken, beyond repair. He had never spoken the truth aloud, not once, and that silence grew heavier with each year. By his 20s, the weight was unbearable. He needed escape. That escape came in the form of drugs. At first, they offered relief, a haze that softened the edges of nightmares, dulled the pain, quieted the relentless thoughts. For someone who had lived for years in the grip of fear, that relief was intoxicating. Substances became a way to silence the silence, not by breaking it, but by drowning it. But drugs are never escape. They are debt. And Duncan found himself paying that debt quickly. What began as numbing became addiction. He craved the haze, the relief, the pause button on his thoughts. Without it, the memories flooded back, sharper than ever. The spiral deepened. Money disappeared into substances. Relationships frayed. Work became unstable. Friends drifted. The very coping mechanism that promised relief was pulling him deeper into despair. Addiction didn't erase his father's presence either. Clifford lingered in Duncan's mind like a ghost. Even though he was no longer a child in that bathroom, the abuse played on loop in his head. Every high was followed by the same crash. Guilt, shame, and memories he could never outrun. The drugs weren't just numbing pain. They were punishing him. Deep down, Duncan believed he deserved the destruction. That belief, planted by years of manipulation and secrecy, was as toxic as the substances themselves. Relationships became casualties of that inner war. Duncan struggled with intimacy, with trust, with connection. He had no model for healthy love, no blueprint for safe affection. Every attempt at closeness carried the shadow of betrayal. He feared vulnerability, even as he longed for it. Partners saw the distance, the walls, the self-destruction, but few understood its source. Duncan couldn't tell them. The silence was still locked tight. Isolation deepened. He moved through crowds, through relationships, through jobs, but always felt apart. Always other. Always marked. There were moments, even in the chaos, when Duncan caught glimpses of another path. A kind word from a friend. A fleeting moment of laughter that felt real. A rare night of sleep without nightmares. These fragments reminded him that life could hold something beyond fear. But they were rare, fragile, easily swallowed by the darkness. The spiral tightened. Addiction grew. Self-worth crumbled. Duncan's life became a cycle of running. Not from his father anymore, but from himself. Yet even in the darkest times, resilience lingered. Survival had been his habit since childhood. It kept him alive when the drugs should have destroyed him. Kept him moving when despair told him to stop. Kept him searching, even blindly, for something better. That resilience was invisible to him then, buried beneath shame and chaos. But it was there, and it would one day carry him to a place he never imagined he could reach. A police station, ready to speak. That day was still years away. For now, Duncan remained trapped in the spiral. Drugs, despair, silence. But beneath it, the cracks were widening. The silence could not last forever. Addiction has a way of rewriting a person's world. It changes priorities, distorts time, shifts every relationship into orbit around its gravity. For Duncan, the spiral happened quickly. What began as moments of release became habits, and habits became chains. The drugs dulled the nightmares, but they also dulled everything else. Days blurred together, nights stretched into emptiness. His body grew tired, his mind restless. He felt older than his years, worn out by secrets and substances alike. Work suffered. Jobs slipped through his fingers, sometimes because of his unreliability, sometimes because he simply walked away. Holding down a routine was impossible when every cell in his body craved escape. Bills piled up. Money disappeared. He borrowed, he owed, he scrambled. The more he tried to manage, the deeper he fell. And always Clifford was there. Not in the flesh, but in memory. Duncan couldn't shake the images, the sensations, the words his father had pressed into him. They replayed relentlessly, haunting him at work, in relationships, in the silence of the night. The drugs didn't silence those memories. They only softened them temporarily. When the high wore off, the ghosts returned sharper than before. Relationships became fragile things. Duncan longed for closeness, for someone to understand him, to love him, to make him feel whole. But intimacy was tangled with fear. Touch carried memories. Vulnerability felt dangerous. He distrusted affection even as he craved it. Partners tried to bridge the distance, but Duncan pushed them away without meaning to. He couldn't explain the shadows inside him. He couldn't put words to the shame he carried. Silence became a wall between him and anyone who tried to love him. And when they left, he believed it proved what he had always feared, that he was unworthy, unlovable, broken. Nights were the worst. Alone in darkened rooms, Duncan's thoughts circled endlessly. The past played on loop. The future felt non-existent. He reached for drugs to drown the silence, to blur the edges of despair. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. There were nights when the weight pressed so heavily that he questioned whether life was worth enduring. He didn't plan, not in detail, but the thought lingered, maybe ending it would mean peace. Maybe it would finally quiet the ghosts. But something always kept him tethered. A flash of memory. His pet's soft warmth. A moment of laughter with friends. The faint hope that maybe things could be different. That tether, fragile as it was, pulled him through the darkest hours. Addiction took more than money and relationships. Took dignity. Duncan saw himself slipping, and with every fall, shame deepened. He promised himself he would stop, but promises broke easily. Each failure reinforced the belief that he was powerless, that he was weak, that his father's legacy had ruined him beyond repair. And still, he survived. That survival was quiet, messy, invisible to outsiders. To the world, Duncan may have looked like just another young man making mistakes. To him, every day was a battle, against his past, against his addictions, against himself. There were moments when he glimpsed another path. A conversation with a friend who showed kindness. A day where he felt strong enough to resist. A rare morning when the nightmares didn't return. These flashes gave him something to hold on to, even if he didn't yet know how to build on them. The cracks were widening. The silence was becoming unsustainable. Duncan was still years away from speaking, but the foundations of secrecy were beginning to crumble. The spiral into addiction was not dramatic at first. It was slow, almost invisible. A drink here, a pill there, a night blurred into haze. But over time, Duncan's entire world began to orbit around the need for escape. He woke thinking about it, worked only to fund it, lived only to numb the memories that stalked him. Money vanished quickly. Bills were ignored, debts mounted. Friends lent him cash at first, then stopped. He pawned belongings, made excuses, lived in cycles of guilt and desperation. The boy who had once clung to silence for survival was now clinging to substances for the same reason. And yet, the drugs never truly erased Clifford. They couldn't. The memories didn't dissolve. They only waited in the corners, ready to surge back when the haze cleared. Every high was temporary, every crash inevitable. Physically, Duncan suffered. His body grew gaunt, his skin pale, his energy drained. Nights without sleep stretched into days. His immune system weakened, illnesses lingered. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The boy in those reflections seemed hollowed out, stripped of vitality, carrying shadows beneath his eyes that told the truth better than words ever could. Psychologically, the toll was even worse. He questioned his worth constantly. He believed he was broken, unfixable, beyond love. The shame of the past fused with the shame of addiction, creating a weight that felt impossible to carry. He hated himself for needing the drugs, yet hated himself even more without them. Relationships, already fragile, collapsed entirely. Friends drifted away, unwilling to watch him self-destruct. Romantic partners left, unable to break through the walls he had built. Family offered no refuge. Duncan had long since learned that silence was the only way to survive there. He was left alone, isolated in a haze of his own making. And yet, even at his lowest, the will to survive remained. Some nights, when despair pressed hardest, Duncan thought of ending it. The idea whispered to him, "You don't have to live like this. You can stop the pain." But he never acted on it. Something always held him back. Sometimes it was the memory of laughter, however fleeting. Sometimes it was the warmth of a pet curling beside him. Sometimes it was nothing more than instinct, the raw, stubborn refusal to let Clifford win by destroying him completely. Addiction stripped Duncan of stability, but it also revealed something he had never fully recognized: his own resilience. Each day he survived was, in itself, an act of defiance. Clifford had stolen his childhood, twisted his adolescence, poisoned his adulthood. But he had not destroyed Duncan. Not yet. That realization, faint as it was, planted a seed. A sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. It didn't happen all at once. Recovery was not yet on the horizon. But moments of clarity began to pierce the haze. Duncan would wake after a binge and feel, for just a second, the raw desire for something better. He would look at the wreckage of his life and know, deep down, that he couldn't continue like this forever. The silence that had protected him as a child was now killing him as an adult. The same secrecy that had once been survival was now suffocation. And though he couldn't yet imagine saying the words aloud, he began to sense that one day he would have to. Looking back, Duncan would describe those years as both the darkest and most formative of his life. They were years of destruction, yes, but also years that revealed the depth of his endurance. He learned that he could survive even the worst nights, even the sharpest memories, even the cruelest crashes. And that survival mattered, because soon he would need it. Soon the silence would shatter. Soon the truth would come rushing out, unstoppable. For now, though, installment 3 closes with Duncan at his lowest. Addicted, isolated, haunted by his father's shadow. But even in that darkness, a flicker of resilience burned. A flicker that would one day ignite into a voice that refused to be silenced. By the time Duncan reached his late 20s, the silence he had carried since childhood was suffocating him. Addiction had stolen years, stripped him of stability, and left him staring into the abyss of self-destruction. He was alive, but barely. Each day was another negotiation with despair, another battle between the part of him that wanted to quit and the part of him that still believed survival mattered. What he didn't know then was that his lowest years were also laying the groundwork for something he had never allowed himself to imagine: the chance to speak. The turning point didn't arrive with drama or revelation. It came slowly, almost invisibly, in moments that seemed small at the time. A conversation with a friend who refused to abandon him. A rare morning when he woke without the fog of drugs clouding his mind. A realization, staring into a cracked bathroom mirror, that he couldn't keep living like this. These moments built quietly, stacking one on top of the other, until they began to form something that felt unfamiliar. Hope. Hope was fragile, though. Every time Duncan tried to pull himself up, the weight of the past threatened to drag him back. Clifford still haunted him. The memories remained sharp, invasive, relentless. But the difference now was that Duncan was starting to see them not as a curse he had to carry alone, but as a truth that deserved to be spoken. The idea terrified him. For years, secrecy had been his survival. Speaking out felt dangerous, like tearing open a wound that could never heal. What if no one believed him? What if speaking destroyed what little stability he had left? What if breaking silence meant losing everything? But another voice whispered, quieter but persistent. What if speaking is the only way to live? Duncan's first attempts at recovery were shaky. He tried cutting back on substances, sometimes managing weeks of sobriety before slipping again. He sought help in programs, support groups, anything that offered structure. Each time he fell, he felt shame press heavier. But he kept trying. And that persistence, messy, imperfect, relentless, was a sign of resilience he didn't yet recognize. In meetings, he listened to others share their struggles. Stories of pain, of survival, of secrets. For the first time, he began to see that silence was not the only option. Others had spoken, and they were still standing. That realization lodged itself deep in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he could too. Friends played a crucial role. Though many had drifted during his darkest years, a few remained. People who refused to give up on him, who saw the flicker of strength beneath the haze. Their encouragement, their belief in him, became lifelines. They reminded him of something Clifford had tried to erase. That he was worthy of love, worthy of healing, worthy of life. Pets, too, continued to anchor him. Their presence, steady and unconditional, offered the kind of comfort that required no words, no explanations. In their eyes, he was not broken. He was simply human. The first hints of disclosure emerged not in bold statements, but in fragments. Hints dropped in conversation, vague references to a difficult past, words spoken half in jest but weighted with truth. Sometimes people missed them. Sometimes they asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. But each attempt chipped away at the wall of silence he had built since childhood. Those fragments mattered. They were rehearsals for the day he would finally speak fully, clearly, without apology. Recovery was not linear. For every step forward, Duncan stumbled two back. There were relapses, nights of despair, weeks lost to old habits. But the difference now was that he no longer believed destruction was his only future. He had glimpsed another possibility, and once glimpsed, it could not be unseen. The silence was beginning to crack. Recovery is rarely a clean climb. It is not a neat staircase upward, but a jagged, uneven slope where progress and relapse exist side by side. Duncan learned this quickly. Some weeks he felt strong. He went to meetings, spoke with others in recovery, kept himself busy. He felt, for the first time, a sense of momentum. He could imagine a life without substances, without waking up in fog. He could imagine a version of himself who wasn't ruled by shadows. But then the past would surge. A smell, a sound, a flash of memory, and suddenly he was back in that bathroom, back under Clifford's grip. The panic would overwhelm him, and the craving would follow. Drugs still offered the quickest way to quiet the storm. He would slip, use again, and the shame would return even heavier than before. That cycle, effort, relapse, shame, defined much of his 20s. But even in relapse, something had changed. He no longer accepted destruction as permanent. Each time he fell, he rose again, however shakily. Each attempt was practice for the day when recovery would finally hold. Psychologically, the pressure was mounting. Years of silence were catching up to him. He could feel it in the way his chest tightened when someone asked about his childhood. He felt it in the rage that erupted at small triggers, the tears that came unexpectedly. His body carried the story even when his mouth refused to tell it. There were days when he tried to convince himself it was all in the past, that what Clifford had done no longer mattered. But denial couldn't hold. The abuse wasn't past. It was present, alive in every nightmare, every craving, every failed relationship. He could not escape it by ignoring it. That realization was terrifying. It meant that speaking the truth was no longer optional. It was necessary. Still, speaking felt impossible. The fear was enormous. Fear of being disbelieved, fear of being judged, fear of shattering the fragile identity he had built. Clifford's threats echoed in his mind even years later. No one will believe you. If you tell, it will destroy everything. Yet a new voice was growing louder. If you don't tell, it will destroy you. In the midst of this internal war, Duncan found strength in connection. In recovery meetings, he saw men and women speak openly about shameful truths, addiction, violence, trauma. He marveled at their courage, their willingness to bear wounds in front of strangers. Each story chipped away at his own silence. If they could speak and survive, maybe he could too. Relationships remained complicated. Trust was fragile, intimacy elusive. But in certain friendships, Duncan allowed himself moments of honesty. He didn't give details yet, but he hinted at the abuse. Sometimes the hints were disguised as jokes. Sometimes they were half-formed confessions drowned in alcohol. But each time he said even a sliver of the truth, he felt the burden lighten. Those fragments were proof. Silence was no longer sustainable. The tipping point came slowly, not in one dramatic event but in the accumulation of years. The pressure built until it was unbearable. The shame that had silenced him for decades was transforming into urgency. He realized that if he didn't speak soon, he might not survive at all. Addiction had shown him how close destruction was. Recovery had shown him what was possible if he chose differently. Between those two truths, a decision was forming. Duncan still didn't know when or how it would happen. But he knew, with a clarity he couldn't ignore, that he would one day have to walk into a police station and say the words he had never dared to say. My father abused me. The thought terrified him, but it also gave him something new, a direction. For the first time, he could see a future where silence was no longer his cage. Recovery was a battlefield, and Duncan fought it with every part of himself. Some days he won small victories, a week of sobriety, a night of restful sleep, a morning where the past didn't intrude. Other days he lost. The losses were brutal, dragging him back into despair, convincing him he was powerless. But unlike before, he no longer stayed down for long. Each relapse hurt, but it didn't erase the progress he had made. Slowly, he began to see himself differently. Not as weak, but as someone carrying an unbearable weight. The fact that he was still alive, still standing, was proof of strength he had never acknowledged. That shift in perspective mattered. It didn't erase the shame, but it loosened its grip. The silence, however, was reaching breaking point. He had lived with secrets for more than 2 decades. They had poisoned his childhood, haunted his adolescence, and nearly destroyed his adulthood. Now, as recovery forced him to face himself, the silence grew intolerable. He began to dream, not just of a life without drugs, but of a life without secrets. He imagined what it would feel like to say the words out loud. He pictured the relief of no longer carrying Clifford's crimes alone. The thought was terrifying, but it was also liberating. The turning point came in private moments of confrontation. Late at night, staring into a mirror, Duncan whispered the truth to his reflection. "He abused me." The words felt foreign, dangerous, but also electric. For the first time, he had spoken them. No one heard, but he had broken the silence, if only to himself. That act, small, invisible to the outside world, was monumental. Proved he could speak. From there, the momentum grew. In conversations with close friends, he began to hint more directly. A reference to trauma, a half-confession spoken through tears. He didn't tell the full story yet, but the walls were crumbling. Each fragment made the idea of disclosure less impossible. As sobriety began to take hold, Duncan found his mind clearer than it had been in years. And with that clarity came rage. Rage at Clifford for what he had done. Rage at himself for carrying silence so long. Rage at a world that allowed such crimes to remain hidden. That rage was dangerous, but it was also fuel. It pushed him toward something he had avoided his whole life. Justice. The decision to go to the police didn't arrive as a single lightning bolt. It built slowly, gathering weight. Every nightmare reminded him of what had been done. Every relapse showed him the cost of silence. Every fragment of confession proved he was ready. By the time the idea solidified, it felt less like a choice and more like destiny. He would go. He would speak. He would name Clifford for what he was. Still, the fear remained. What if no one believed him? What if the investigation failed? What if speaking cost him everything? These doubts lingered, gnawing at him. But beneath them, a stronger truth pulsed. If he didn't speak, he might not survive at all. That truth gave him courage. In the final months before disclosure, Duncan felt like he was living between 2 worlds. In one, he was still the silent child, carrying secrets, protecting his abuser by staying quiet. In the other, he was the man preparing to shatter that silence, to reclaim his story, to seek justice. The tension between those 2 identities was nearly unbearable. And then, one day, it became clear. The time had come. The morning Duncan decided to walk into the police station was not extraordinary. There was no cinematic backdrop, no dramatic thunderstorm, no grand gesture. It was just another gray English day, the kind where clouds hung low and the air smelled faintly of rain. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary man heading down an ordinary street. But inside Duncan, the storm was immense. His chest tightened with every step. His mind replayed decades of memories. The bathroom, the threats, the silence. 4 years, Clifford's voice had echoed in his head. "No one will believe you. If you tell, it will ruin everything." Now, Duncan was about to find out if that was true. Walking into the station felt like walking into fire. His legs carried him forward, but his body screamed to turn back. Fear pressed down on him like a weight. His hands trembled. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool air. At the reception desk, his voice cracked as he spoke. "I need to report. I need to report abuse." The words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. They were the most dangerous words he had ever spoken, and also the most liberating. For the first time, the silence was broken not in whispers to a mirror, not in half-confessions to friends, but in the open to people who could act. The officers listened. They took his details, guided him into a quiet room, offered him water. To Duncan, it felt surreal. For decades, he had carried this alone, convinced no one would ever hear him. Now, strangers in uniform were leaning forward, pens ready, waiting for him to tell his story. And so he began, halting at first, his throat tight, his words stumbling. But once he started, the floodgates opened. He told them about Clifford, the father who should have protected him but instead had violated him. He described the bathroom, the threats, the secrecy. He spoke of the nightmares, the addiction, the decades of silence. The officers didn't flinch. They didn't dismiss him. They listened. And with every nod, every question, every note scribbled down, Duncan felt the lie Clifford had drilled into him begin to crumble. People did believe him. People were listening. When the statement was finished, Duncan felt hollow and raw, like his insides had been scraped clean. Relief mingled with terror. He had finally spoken. But what would happen next? What would the investigation uncover? How would Clifford respond? Would justice truly follow, or would silence reassert itself in new ways? Leaving the station that day, Duncan felt both lighter and more burdened. Lighter because the truth was no longer locked inside him. More burdened because now the truth was out in the world, and there was no turning back. That night, Duncan barely slept. His mind replayed every word he had spoken, second-guessing, fearing he had said too little or too much or the wrong things entirely. The old voice of Clifford tried to creep back in. They won't believe you. They'll twist it. They'll protect me. But another voice, newer and stronger, answered back. You've already told them. It's too late for silence now. The investigation began quickly. Detectives contacted him, arranged follow-up interviews, asked for details he had never said aloud before. Each interview was another test of endurance, reliving the worst moments of his life, putting them into words, forcing himself to stay steady as professionals dissected the trauma. It was painful. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. But it was also necessary. For the first time, Clifford's crimes were no longer secrets. They were evidence. The first interview had been terrifying, but the second was worse. In the days leading up to it, Duncan felt his nerves unravel. Every part of him wanted to cancel, to run, to hide. Speaking once had nearly broken him. How could he possibly survive going through it again? But he forced himself to show up. This was no longer about silence. It was about truth. The detectives were patient but relentless. They asked for details, dates, times, places. They needed him to relive the scenes he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. Duncan felt his stomach twist as he described the bathroom. The way Clifford's footsteps had sounded in the hallway, the smell of soap, the sickening routine of abuse that had defined his childhood. More than once, he broke down mid-sentence, his words dissolving into sobs. The officers paused, gave him water, reassured him he could continue when ready. But they never let him drift away from the details. They needed the truth in all its rawness to build a case. Each interview left Duncan drained. He would stumble home afterward, collapse into bed, and lie there staring at the ceiling. Sleep rarely came. When it did, nightmares followed. His body carried the stress, headaches, muscle tension, waves of nausea that came without warning. And yet, beneath the pain, something extraordinary was happening. For the first time, Duncan was no longer alone with his story. The weight, though crushing, was shared. Telling the police was one thing. Waiting for what came next was another. The detectives promised they would investigate thoroughly, that Clifford would be questioned, that justice was possible. But for Duncan, the waiting was torture. Every day felt like holding his breath underwater, not knowing when he would surface. When word reached him that Clifford had been contacted, a chill ran through his body. It was real now. His father knew. The man who had ruled his childhood with fear, who had silenced him with threats, now understood that the silence was broken. That knowledge terrified Duncan. He imagined retaliation, imagined Clifford manipulating others, imagined his abuser finding new ways to discredit him. Old fears surged. What if he talks his way out of this? What if they believe him instead of me? But there was also a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time, Clifford was being forced to face consequences. The man who had hidden in shadows was being dragged into the light. Friends who knew pieces of Duncan's truth rallied around him. They checked in, offered rides to interviews, sat with him when the pressure became too much. Their support was vital. Without them, Duncan might have folded under the weight of it all. Still, shame lingered. Saying the words to police didn't erase decades of silence. Duncan still struggled to believe he deserved justice, that he was strong enough to withstand what was coming. Trauma had taught him to doubt himself, to expect abandonment, to assume failure. But each interview, each signed statement, each official note in the detective's files was proof that his story mattered. And that proof was slowly rewriting the narrative Clifford had forced into him since childhood. The investigation stretched on. Detectives tracked timelines, sought corroboration, pieced together a picture of Clifford that went beyond Duncan's testimony. The process was agonizingly slow but methodical. To Duncan, it felt like watching a house of lies being dismantled brick by brick. He didn't yet know if justice would prevail. But he knew one thing for certain. The silence was gone, and it was never coming back. When detectives finally contacted Clifford, Duncan felt it like a shockwave. For decades, his father had moved through life unchallenged. Charming neighbors, earning trust, presenting the image of an ordinary man. Now that mask was cracking. The first report Duncan received was simple. Clifford had denied everything. He insisted his son was lying, that Duncan was unstable, that his memories were confused. The words didn't surprise him. Clifford had always relied on manipulation, always turned lies into armor. What hurt wasn't the denial itself, but the realization that his father would never acknowledge the truth. Still, denial didn't erase evidence. Investigators pressed forward. They gathered Duncan's statements, built a timeline, explored Clifford's history. And with each passing week, Duncan's voice carried further into official records, beyond the walls of silence where it had once been trapped. Waiting was agony. Duncan's mind spun endlessly. What if they dropped the case? What if Clifford convinced everyone it was fiction? What if speaking had been for nothing? He carried these doubts like stones in his pocket, heavy and unavoidable. Some nights, the pressure sent him spiraling. He paced the room, fought panic attacks, struggled to quiet the rising tide of fear. Recovery, already fragile, wavered under the strain. Old cravings crept back, whispering promises of escape. But he resisted, clinging to the knowledge that he had come too far to turn back now. What sustained him were the glimpses of freedom. Each time he reminded himself that the secret was no longer his alone, he felt lighter. For once, Clifford's crimes were not locked in his chest. They were written in files, spoken in interviews, pursued by detectives who believed him. That reality mattered more than he could put into words. Clifford, meanwhile, began to show signs of unraveling. Though Duncan didn't see him face to face, he heard through whispers. His father was anxious, defensive, paranoid. The control he had once exercised so confidently was slipping. For the first time, Clifford was the one under scrutiny, the one whose life was being dissected. That shift gave Duncan something he had never felt before: power. Not power over others, but power over himself. For so long, Clifford had dictated the story. Now, Duncan was reclaiming it. As months passed, detectives assured him the case was moving forward. Slowly, methodically, they were building what they needed. Duncan clung to their words. He still feared disappointment, but he also understood that justice required patience. What surprised him most was how speaking began to reshape his identity. For decades, he had seen himself as broken, as a victim bound by shame. But now, in telling his story, he saw glimpses of something else. Survivor, fighter, truth-teller. It didn't erase the pain, but it reframed it. The emotional toll remained steep. He often woke drenched in sweat, nightmares vivid and cruel. During the day, he carried exhaustion in his bones. But even when fear rose highest, he reminded himself of one fact that had changed everything. Clifford no longer owned his silence. That realization was its own kind of justice. By the time installment 5 closes, Duncan has crossed an irreversible threshold. He has spoken. The police know. Clifford knows. The silence that once defined his existence is shattered forever. The investigation is ongoing, the outcome uncertain. But for Duncan, the greatest shift has already occurred. He is no longer alone, no longer carrying the weight in secret. The truth is out, and that truth is a force that cannot be contained. The decision to prosecute Clifford was not announced overnight. It came after months of painstaking investigation, endless interviews, and hours of Duncan reliving his trauma in front of strangers. But when detectives finally told him that charges were being filed, the words hit him with a force he could hardly describe. On one hand, relief. For so long, he had feared his story would vanish into silence again, dismissed as not enough. Now, the state was taking his truth seriously enough to bring Clifford before a judge. That mattered. That validated everything. On the other hand, terror. Charges meant trial. Trial meant facing his father, not as a shadow in his nightmares, but as a living, breathing man, standing in the same room. Duncan's stomach twisted at the thought. Could he do it? Could he survive the glare of cross-examination, the cold gaze of Clifford's eyes, the brutal reality of speaking his story in public? There was no choice. The path forward was set. The waiting began. Trials do not happen quickly. Paperwork, scheduling, legal maneuvering. All of it dragged on for months. To Duncan, it felt like torture. Each day stretched into an eternity, filled with anxiety and restless energy. His mind spun with questions. Would the jury believe him? Would Clifford twist the narrative? Would justice finally be delivered? Or would it slip through his fingers? The uncertainty gnawed at him. Some nights, he woke gasping for breath, heart pounding, his body reacting as though Clifford were in the room. Other nights, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the words he might one day speak on the witness stand. The Crown Prosecution Service guided him through the process. Prosecutors explained what to expect, how evidence would be presented, how Clifford's defense might attack his credibility, how the courtroom would feel. They offered preparation sessions, helping him build resilience against the onslaught of questions that would come. These sessions were brutal. Duncan sat in sterile conference rooms, answering mock cross-examinations designed to rattle him. The prosecutors played devil's advocate, interrupting, challenging, casting doubt. It was a rehearsal for the worst, and it left him shaken every time. But it also strengthened him. Each session proved that he could withstand the assault without breaking. Each practice round was a reminder. The truth was on his side. Clifford, meanwhile, remained defiant. He pled not guilty, of course. To him, denial was survival. Duncan learned through prosecutors that his father's legal team planned to attack his memory, to portray him as unstable, as an addict whose word could not be trusted. The thought enraged him, but it also steeled him. He had anticipated this. Clifford had always relied on lies. What Clifford underestimated was Duncan's ability to endure them now. Friends and allies gathered closer during this time. Some accompanied him to court hearings, others called regularly, reminding him that he was not alone. Still, the loneliness of the process remained. Ultimately, it was Duncan who had to take the stand, Duncan who had to face Clifford, Duncan who had to peel back the layers of silence in front of strangers. The burden was heavy, but he carried it because he knew the alternative was worse. Silence had nearly destroyed him. Speaking, even in court, was his only path to freedom. The months crawled toward trial, each day a test of endurance. Duncan clung to recovery, to therapy, to anything that gave him stability. He journaled, he exercised. He forced himself to eat even when anxiety strangled his appetite. He knew he needed every ounce of strength for the moment the courtroom doors opened. And in the quiet moments, when fear pressed hardest, he reminded himself of one unshakable truth. Clifford's reign of silence was over. No matter what happened in court, no matter how the jury ruled, the truth was no longer buried. It was out in the open, undeniable, unerasable. That knowledge gave him the courage to keep going. The first pretrial hearing came like a thunderclap. Duncan had been told it was just procedure, dates, legal language, formalities that moved the process along. But for him, it meant something far more visceral. He would see Clifford again. The idea made his stomach churn. For weeks beforehand, he wrestled with it. What would it feel like to be in the same building as his father? Would Clifford look at him? Would his eyes carry the same coldness that haunted his memories? Or would he wear that familiar mask of charm, pretending to be the victim of some great injustice? On the morning of the hearing, Duncan felt as though he were moving through water. His chest was tight, his hands clammy, every step toward the courthouse heavier than the last. Friends walked beside him, their presence steady, but the weight remained his to carry. When Clifford finally appeared, it was like being struck. He was older now, gray at the temples, heavier, the years visible on his face. And yet, in an instant, Duncan saw not the aging man but the predator of his childhood. His breath caught, his body tensed, memories crashing back with violent clarity. Clifford glanced toward him, expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes met. Duncan felt rage and terror surge simultaneously. Then Clifford looked away, as if Duncan were nothing more than an inconvenience. That dismissal stung more than he expected. But beneath it burned defiance. He was no longer the child Clifford could control. He was here to speak, and Clifford would have to hear him. The hearing was brief, a blur of legal language Duncan barely absorbed. What mattered was that the trial date was set. In a matter of months, everything would unfold. Those months were grueling. Anticipation weighed on him constantly. He couldn't escape it. In the supermarket, on the bus, lying awake at night. Always the thought returned. Soon, I'll be on that stand. Soon, I'll be face to face with him. Soon, the whole world will hear what I've carried alone. Therapy sessions became lifelines. His therapist coached him through grounding techniques, helped him untangle the triggers that came with anticipation. Sometimes they practiced eye contact. Duncan imagining Clifford's stare, holding his composure, refusing to flinch. Other times they rehearsed his testimony, ensuring his voice would remain steady even under pressure. The preparation was exhausting, but it was also empowering. For the first time in his life, Duncan wasn't avoiding Clifford. He was preparing to confront him. As the trial drew nearer, Duncan noticed subtle shifts in himself. Fear still lived in him, but it was no longer absolute. Courage grew alongside it, rooted in the knowledge that he had already survived the worst. Clifford had taken his childhood, his innocence, years of his adulthood, but he hadn't taken his will to fight. That realization gave him something unexpected. Pride. Not pride in the suffering, but in the survival. Pride that he had carried the truth long enough to finally set it free. On the eve of the trial, Duncan sat awake in his small flat, staring out the window at the quiet street below. The city was still, the night heavy. He thought about the boy he had once been, terrified, silenced, convinced no one would ever believe him. He thought about the years lost to addiction, to shame, to Clifford's shadow. And then he thought about the man he had become. A man about to stand in court, to speak the truth in the very place where silence was once law. Whatever happened tomorrow, one fact was unshakable. He had already won a victory Clifford could never erase. He had spoken. He had broken free. The first day of trial dawned gray and cold. Duncan barely slept the night before. He lay awake listening to the silence, his body tense as if bracing for impact. By the time morning came, exhaustion and adrenaline mingled in his veins. Walking into the courthouse felt like stepping into another world. The air was heavy with tension. Footsteps echoed off polished floors, and the sound of shuffling papers and murmured voices carried through the hallways. Every corner seemed to vibrate with anticipation. When he entered the courtroom, his eyes were immediately drawn to Clifford. His father sat at the defense table, suited and composed, his expression calm, almost smug. To the jury, he appeared like any aging man defending himself. To Duncan, he was the monster who had stolen his childhood. The sight of him sent shivers racing up Duncan's spine. For a moment, the urge to run was overwhelming. But he stayed seated, clinging to the anchor of his friends in the gallery, the prosecutors at his side, and the simple truth that brought him here. It was time to speak. When his name was called, Duncan rose and walked to the witness stand. Each step felt weighted, deliberate. like marching through years of silence toward a reckoning he had never thought possible. He raised his hand, swore his oath, and sat down. The prosecutor began gently. Questions came in calm, measured tones. Can you tell us about your childhood? Can you describe your relationship with your father? When did the abuse begin? First, his voice shook. The courtroom blurred. He gripped the sides of the witness box, grounding himself, forcing air into his lungs. But then, like a river breaking through a dam, the words began to flow. He told them about the bathroom, the threats, the fear that had governed his childhood. He described the years of silence, the addiction that followed, the day he finally walked into a police station and told the truth. The courtroom was still. Jurors leaned forward, their faces solemn. The judge listened intently. Even Clifford, usually quick to perform, sat stiff, his jaw clenched. For the first time, Duncan saw something flicker in his father's eyes. Not dominance, but discomfort. It gave him strength. Then came the defense. They rose with precision, their voices sharp, their questions pointed. Isn't it true you were an addict for many years? Isn't it possible your memories are distorted? Could this be resentment against your father, rather than fact? Each question was a blade, aimed to cut him down, to sow doubt in the jury's mind. Duncan felt his throat tighten, his pulse quicken. Old fears returned, the fear that no one would believe him, that Clifford's lies would triumph again. But he remembered the rehearsals. He remembered the hours spent preparing for this moment. Most importantly, he remembered the truth. Yes, I struggled with addiction, he admitted, voice steady. But the reason I struggled is because of what he did to me. That doesn't make my memories false. It makes them undeniable. The courtroom held its breath. The cross-examination continued, relentless, but Duncan did not break. He stumbled at times, emotions rising, but he always found his way back. Every answer he gave was a piece of the puzzle, building a picture of Clifford that no denial could erase. When it was finally over, Duncan felt drained, hollowed out. He stepped down from the stand on shaking legs, his body trembling with exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue was a fierce, quiet pride. He had done it. He had faced Clifford in the open, spoken the truth, and refused to be silenced. As the trial pressed on, Duncan listened to arguments, evidence, and legal sparring. But for him, the most important battle was already fought. He had taken back his voice. The outcome still hung in the balance, but no matter what verdict the jury returned, he knew he had reclaimed something Clifford could never steal again. His agency. The boy who once cowered in silence was gone. In his place stood a man who had faced the monster in daylight. The trial had stretched on for days, but to Duncan it felt like years. Every morning he walked into the courthouse, the weight pressing heavier on his chest. Each session was a tightrope, balancing the fragile hope of justice against the crushing fear of disappointment. Now, at last, it was drawing to a close. The prosecution rose first for closing arguments. Their voice was clear, steady, commanding. They walked the jury back through Duncan's testimony, through the timelines, through the patterns of behavior that painted Clifford not as a misunderstood father, but as a predator who had manipulated silence for decades. This case is about trust betrayed, the prosecutor said, their words ringing in the still courtroom. It is about a father who used his position of authority to abuse, to silence, and to control. Duncan's courage in coming forward after years of suffering is not weakness. It is the strongest evidence you will ever hear. The details he has given, the pain he carries, the consistency of his account, all point to one undeniable truth. Clifford is guilty. Duncan sat in the gallery, hands clasped, heart pounding. Each word felt like validation, like the world finally seeing the reality he had carried alone. Then came the defense. Their tone was polished, confident, surgical. They painted Duncan as unreliable, a man broken by addiction and resentment, motivated by bitterness rather than truth. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense lawyer began. You are being asked to convict a man based on memories from decades ago, presented by someone who is admitted to years of drug use, instability, and anger toward his father. Memory is fragile. Addiction distorts reality. Resentment fuels exaggeration. This is not justice. This is vengeance dressed as truth. The words cut, sharp and merciless. Duncan's stomach twisted. For a moment, the old doubts returned. What if they believe him? What if Clifford wins again? But then he glanced at the jurors. Many of them looked unmoved, their expressions guarded, but not hostile. He reminded himself he had told the truth. That was unshakable. The judge delivered instructions, his voice measured and deliberate. The jury was reminded of their duty, to weigh the evidence, to deliberate carefully, to reach a verdict beyond reasonable doubt. Then they were dismissed to deliberate. The silence that followed was unbearable. Duncan sat in the hallway, time moving strangely, minutes stretching into hours, hours collapsing into moments. Each tick of the clock was a hammer on his nerves. He paced. He sat. He tried to distract himself with conversation, but his mind always drifted back to the jury room. What were they saying? Were they doubting him? Were they convinced? Were they even now preparing to shatter his fragile hope? The waiting was worse than testimony, worse than cross-examination. At least then he had control of his words. Now everything was out of his hands. After hours that felt like eternity, the jury returned. The courtroom filled with tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Duncan sat rigid, every muscle in his body clenched, his pulse roaring in his ears. The clerk asked the foreman the question, "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes," came the reply. Duncan held his breath. The foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in their hands. On the charges of sexual abuse. The pause was endless. Duncan's vision tunneled, the world narrowing to this single moment. "We find the defendant, Clifford, guilty." The word struck Duncan like thunder. For a heartbeat, he couldn't process it. Guilty. Clifford guilty. His father, the man who had ruled his life with fear, branded by the truth in a court of law. A flood of emotions surged at once. Relief so sharp it was almost painful, grief for the years lost, rage at what had been stolen, and a deep, trembling gratitude that his voice had finally been heard. Behind him, friends squeezed his shoulder, tears in their eyes. Ahead of him, Clifford sat frozen, his mask cracked, his power gone. For the first time in Duncan's life, justice had spoken louder than silence. The word guilty echoed in Duncan's ears long after the jury was dismissed. The courtroom erupted in movement. The judge thanking the jurors for their service, clerks gathering papers, murmurs filling the air. But Duncan sat still, his body frozen, his mind trying to catch up to reality. For decades, he had lived with a single narrative. Clifford always wins. Clifford always controls. Clifford always silences. Now, in a single word, that truth had been shattered. Clifford did not look at him as he was led away. There was no remorse, no apology. Only the stony defiance of a man who had spent his life cloaked in denial. But it didn't matter anymore. The verdict had stripped away his armor. He was guilty, not just in Duncan's heart but in the eyes of the law. In the days that followed, Duncan found himself in a haze. Friends congratulated him, told him he was brave, told him justice had been done. Strangers who had followed the case offered words of support. He nodded, he smiled weakly, but inside he felt hollow. Justice had been served, yes, but nothing could return what was lost. No verdict could give him back the childhood stolen from him, the years drowned in addiction, the nights haunted by nightmares. Clifford's conviction was monumental, and yet it also revealed the depth of wounds that would never fully heal. At night, sleep still eluded him. His body carried the same tension, the same scars. But when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, something had shifted. The fear was gone. Clifford no longer had power over him. That knowledge was a balm, even if the pain remained. Weeks later came sentencing. The courtroom once again filled with the heavy silence of anticipation. Duncan sat in the gallery, hands folded, watching as Clifford was brought in. The judge spoke at length about betrayal, about the seriousness of Clifford's crimes, about the lifelong impact on Duncan. Each word felt like validation, a public acknowledgement of the suffering he had endured. When the sentence was read, years in prison, a number that meant Clifford would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Duncan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. Release. The man who had ruled his life with threats would never again walk freely in the world. Leaving the courthouse that day, Duncan felt the cool air on his face, the sky wide above him. For the first time in his memory, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't carrying a secret. He wasn't silenced. He was free. But freedom, he learned, is complicated. With Clifford gone, there was space, and in that space, grief rushed in. He grieved the boy who had been silenced, the years wasted in pain, the relationships fractured by trauma. Justice was real, but so was the emptiness left behind. And yet, as he walked away from the courthouse, Duncan understood something vital. Healing wasn't about erasing scars. It was about living beyond them. The days after sentencing were strangely quiet. For years, Duncan had lived in a storm. First the abuse itself, then the chaos of addiction, then the harrowing process of disclosure and trial. Now, with Clifford locked away and the case closed, silence filled the space where chaos had been. It wasn't peace, not yet. It was something different. A stillness that forced him to face what remained. At first, he didn't know what to do with himself. The courthouse had been his battleground, the trial his consuming focus. Now there were no more hearings, no more testimony, no more waiting for verdicts. Just life, raw and unstructured, waiting to be lived. He found himself walking the streets of his city, watching ordinary people carry on with their routines, buying groceries, catching buses, laughing with children. He envied their normalcy, the ease with which they moved through the world. But he also felt, for the first time, that perhaps such normalcy wasn't entirely out of reach. The media coverage lingered for a while. Headlines framed Clifford as a monster father. The betrayal of family trust splashed across articles. Journalists requested interviews. Television producers sent inquiries. Duncan hesitated. He wanted the truth to be known, but he also feared being defined solely by what had been done to him. In the end, he chose carefully. He agreed to speak when it felt purposeful, when he believed his voice might help others still trapped in silence. Each time he shared, he was careful to center not just the horror of the abuse but the possibility of survival. It was exhausting, yes, but also liberating. Each telling stripped another layer of shame away. Privately, the healing was harder. Nights were still restless. Flashbacks still ambushed him. Sometimes, out of nowhere, he'd hear Clifford's voice in his mind, cold and commanding. But now, instead of shrinking from it, he answered back. "You don't own me anymore." The words became a mantra. He poured himself into recovery, therapy, group meetings, connecting with others who had endured similar pain. In those circles, he found a strange comfort. Hearing others' stories reminded him he wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a community of survivors, each of them carrying scars, each of them learning to live beyond the shadows. Still, there were days when victory felt hollow. Justice had been delivered, but it hadn't undone the damage. There was no rewinding the clock, no reclaiming the years lost. Some wounds, he realized, were permanent, but permanent did not mean defining. He began to understand that healing was not about erasing pain but integrating it, shaping a life where scars coexisted with strength, where memory coexisted with growth. And slowly, in the quiet after the storm, Duncan started to feel glimpses of something new. Hope. On a chilly morning months after sentencing, he stood on a hill overlooking the city. The skyline stretched wide before him, the sun breaking through clouds in slivers of gold. For the first time in his memory, he felt the weight of Clifford's presence lift. His father was gone from his life, his power dismantled. The boy who once believed silence was his destiny was now a man who had spoken in a courtroom and been heard. Justice wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to give Duncan the foundation he needed. And from that foundation, he would begin to rebuild. The courtroom doors had closed, the verdict delivered, the sentence passed. For the outside world, the story was finished. Headlines faded, reporters moved on, and Clifford's name was reduced to an entry in prison records. But for Duncan, the story was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. Justice had brought him freedom, yes, but freedom was complicated. It meant stepping into a life he had never truly lived before. A life without Clifford's shadow dictating his every move. And that was terrifying. For decades, Duncan's existence had been shaped by survival. Hiding, numbing, fighting, enduring. Now he was faced with an unfamiliar challenge, building. The first weeks after sentencing felt surreal. Simple things like making breakfast, walking through the park, or hearing laughter spill from a nearby pub carried a new weight. He wasn't constantly glancing over his shoulder anymore, wasn't wondering if Clifford might suddenly reappear. But the absence of fear left behind an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. At night, he still woke in a sweat, heart pounding, body braced for danger. Only now, when he sat up gasping in the dark, he reminded himself, "He can't touch me anymore. He can't hurt me. He's gone." The words were true, but believing them fully was a slower process. He threw himself into therapy. His counselor encouraged him to see healing not as an endpoint, but as a journey, one that required patience, gentleness, and acceptance of setbacks. "You've lived with trauma like a second skin," she told him. "It doesn't peel off in a day, but it also doesn't have to suffocate you anymore." Group sessions were harder. Sitting in a circle of strangers, listening to them share their own experiences of abuse and survival, left him raw. Sometimes he wanted to run, to never hear another story of pain. Other times, their voices gave him strength. Each person there was a mirror of resilience, proof that scars didn't define worth. Slowly, he began to contribute. The first time he spoke aloud about Clifford in that circle, his voice cracked, but no one flinched. Heads nodded. Hands reached out. For the first time in his life, he felt surrounded by people who understood without judgment. Beyond therapy, Duncan began reaching out to repair the relationships fractured by his silence and his addictions. Old friends who had drifted away, siblings who had struggled to understand, people he had pushed out in his darkest years. Some welcomed him back with open arms, grateful for his honesty. Others remained distant, their wounds too deep to mend quickly. He accepted both responses. Healing wasn't just about reclaiming others. It was also about forgiving himself for the bridges he had burned and choosing to build new ones where possible. But the hardest relationship to rebuild was the one with himself. For so long, he had believed he was broken beyond repair, defined by what Clifford had done. Even with justice behind him, that voice still whispered in quiet moments, "You are damaged. You will never be whole." Challenging that belief became his daily work. He practiced affirmations that felt awkward at first. "I am worthy. I am more than what was done to me. I have a future." Some days they felt like lies. Other days they sparked a flicker of truth. It was in those flickers that hope began to grow. He discovered new routines, small acts of care that grounded him. Morning walks by the river, cooking meals instead of skipping them, journaling before bed, spilling onto the page the thoughts that once festered unspoken. Each routine was a brick, small but steady, in the foundation of a life he was learning to build. And gradually, something remarkable began to happen. Duncan caught himself imagining a future, not just surviving another day, but envisioning years ahead, goals, dreams, possibilities he had never allowed himself before. For a man who once believed his life would end in silence, that was revolutionary. Recovery gave Duncan something he hadn't expected: space. For the first time in his life, he had room to think not only about what had happened to him, but about what could happen next. That space was uncomfortable at first. Silence left him face to face with memories he had long drowned in alcohol or numbed with drugs. But instead of running, he started to shape that silence into something useful. He began writing. At first, it was just scraps in his journal, fragmented thoughts, flashes of memory, emotions too heavy to say aloud. But the more he wrote, the more he discovered that words had power. They helped him organize chaos, put shape to things that had once been unspeakable. Eventually, those pages grew into essays and reflections. Some he shared with his therapist, others he kept private. But every word was an act of reclaiming what Clifford had stolen. His voice. Opportunities to share his story publicly soon followed. Support groups asked him to speak. Survivors reached out, wanting to hear how he had endured. At first, the idea terrified him. Each telling felt like tearing open old wounds. But then he realized something. Every time he spoke, shame loosened its grip. His story no longer belonged to Clifford, it belonged to him. And the more he used it to help others, the less it defined him in isolation. He didn't want to become a symbol. He didn't want to be reduced to the boy who was abused. But he did want his survival to mean something. If one person found the courage to break their silence because they heard his words, then the years of carrying his truth alone would not be in vain. Even as he stepped into advocacy, Duncan wrestled with tension. He craved privacy, the right to simply be a man living an ordinary life. Some days he longed for anonymity, to walk down the street without anyone knowing the weight he carried. Other days he felt a calling to stand in the open, to be the voice he once needed to hear. It wasn't an easy balance. Some nights after speaking publicly, he would collapse at home, drained, questioning whether exposing himself was worth it. But then a message would arrive, from a stranger who had listened, from a survivor who felt less alone, and he would remember why he had chosen to speak at all. Slowly, Duncan began to experience moments of joy, small at first, almost startling in their simplicity. A walk by the river where the water shimmered in sunlight. A shared laugh with a friend that wasn't shadowed by shame. A quiet night where sleep came easily, dreams unbroken. For years, joy had felt dangerous, as if it could be snatched away at any moment. Now, he allowed himself to lean into it. These moments didn't erase the past, but they reminded him that life could hold more than pain. One day, sitting in a cafe, notebook open, Duncan caught himself sketching plans, not about trials or therapy, but about the future. He jotted down ideas, maybe pursuing studies, maybe writing a book, maybe working with organizations that supported children at risk. The thought surprised him. For so long, his imagination had been chained to survival. Now it was reaching forward. And in that moment, Duncan realized something profound. He was not just a survivor. He was a man with choices, with agency, with a life still unfolding. With Clifford gone, Duncan no longer lived under the weight of daily fear. But he quickly discovered that freedom wasn't about the absence of chains. It was about learning how to walk without them. For years, his identity had been framed around survival. Every decision, every habit, every thought was shaped by trauma. Now, as the dust of the trial settled, he faced the daunting task of asking, "Who am I beyond what was done to me?" He started small. He reconnected with old hobbies he had once abandoned. Music returned first. Dusting off a battered guitar, he let his fingers stumble over strings, awkward but determined. The notes were clumsy, but they were his. In those moments, he wasn't Duncan the survivor or Duncan the witness. He was simply a man making music, present in the sound. Friendships, too, began to grow again. Coffee with an old mate, a phone call with someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The conversations were tentative at first, but they carried a warmth he had missed. For so long, shame had isolated him. Now, honesty was building bridges back to others. There were setbacks, of course. Triggers still lurked in unexpected corners. A smell, a phrase, even a news story could pull him back into the grip of old fear. Sometimes he spiraled, convinced he was broken beyond repair. But therapy reminded him of a crucial truth. Healing was not linear. It was a path with setbacks and stumbles, but always moving forward. He began to see his scars differently. Where once they were marks of shame, now they became symbols of resilience. They told a story not only of what he had endured, but of what he had overcome. Gradually, Duncan embraced a philosophy that would carry him forward. That healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a life big enough to hold both the pain and the joy. He couldn't rewrite his childhood. He couldn't erase the abuse. But he could choose how to live now in the present. He could choose kindness over bitterness, courage over silence, connection over isolation. One evening, sitting by his window with a cup of tea, he reflected on the journey so far. He thought of the boy who had once cowered in silence, convinced no one would ever believe him. He thought of the man who had stood in court and spoken the truth. And he thought of the life he was now beginning to shape. Fragile, imperfect, but undeniably his. For the first time in his memory, the future felt open. It wouldn't be easy. There would always be scars. But he no longer feared them, because scars, he realized, were proof of survival. And survival was just the beginning. In the quiet months after sentencing, Duncan thought he might finally fade into normal life. He imagined walking the streets unnoticed, building a private world that belonged only to him. But the truth was different. His case had drawn attention. Reporters still called, organizations reached out, and survivors wrote to him from across the country. His story was no longer just his. It had rippled outward, touching others who saw in him a reflection of their own silence. At first, he resisted. The spotlight was suffocating. He had spent years wishing only to be invisible, and now strangers wanted him to relive the darkest moments of his life for audiences who would consume it in headlines and sound bites. But then he read one of the letters, from a young man who had endured abuse and never told a soul until he heard Duncan's testimony. "You gave me courage," the letter said. "If you can speak, maybe I can too." That was when Duncan realized that silence, once his prison, could now become someone else's freedom, if he was willing to keep speaking. His first step into public advocacy was small. A community event organized by a local survivors group. He sat in a circle of folding chairs. No cameras, no reporters, just people who knew the language of pain. When he shared his story, there were no gasps of shock, no judgment, only nods of recognition. Felt safe. From there, the invitations grew. A charity asked him to speak at a fundraiser. A local newspaper wanted an interview. Then came larger requests, national television programs, panel discussions, conferences on child protection. Every time he stood on a stage or sat in front of a camera, he felt exposed. His palms sweated, his throat tightened, his heart raced. But then he looked into the audience and saw faces leaning forward, listening. Survivors who whispered thank you afterward. Parents who promised to listen more carefully to their children. Professionals who vowed to be more vigilant. And in those moments, Duncan understood. His pain could have purpose. Still, advocacy carried a cost. Each telling of his story meant reopening wounds. After speeches, he sometimes returned home exhausted, numb, replaying memories he thought he'd buried. At times, he wondered if he was sacrificing his own healing for the sake of others. But therapy helped him frame it differently. "You're not just reliving it," his counselor said. "You're reframing it. Every time you speak, you're turning what was once a weapon against you into a tool for change. That's power." It didn't make the exhaustion vanish, but it gave it meaning. As his visibility grew, Duncan wrestled with identity again. To the public, he was becoming a symbol. The survivor who spoke out, the son who brought his father to justice. It was powerful, yes, but it also felt like another kind of cage. He longed to be known not just for what had been done to him, but for who he was, his humor, his interests, his dreams. He wanted to be Duncan, not just Duncan the survivor. Balancing those identities became part of his journey. He learned to set boundaries, to say no to some interviews, to take breaks from advocacy, to protect his private life. His voice was powerful, but it did not have to consume every corner of his existence. Despite the challenges, Duncan began to feel something he had never known before: purpose. He wasn't just surviving, he was contributing. His words were sparking conversations, inspiring action, giving others the courage to speak. And in giving to others, he found he was also giving to himself. Proof that Clifford hadn't won, that silence hadn't been the final word. One evening, after a particularly moving conference, Duncan stood outside looking at the city lights. Survivors had come up to him in tears, thanking him for making them feel less alone. And for the first time in a long time, he felt proud. Not just for enduring, not just for surviving, but for transforming his pain into something that mattered. The The more Duncan spoke publicly, the more he realized advocacy was a double-edged sword. On one side, it gave his story meaning, turning decades of pain into a weapon against silence. On the other, it demanded pieces of him he wasn't always ready to give. There were days when he wanted to disappear, to live quietly without ever uttering Clifford's name again. But then a message would arrive, from a mother who finally believed her child, from a man who said Duncan's courage had kept him alive. These reminders pulled him back, showing him that his voice carried power beyond himself. His life became a balancing act. By day, he attended conferences, panels, and survivor meetings. By night, he worked on himself, journaling, meditating, learning to simply exist outside the identity of survivor. Therapy became his anchor, reminding him that he was allowed to step away, allowed to rest, allowed to be more than his trauma. At one event, standing before a room full of professionals, Duncan spoke words that surprised even him. "I used to believe silence was survival, but survival is not living. Speaking doesn't erase the scars, but it takes away their power. It turns them into proof, not of what broke us, but of what couldn't destroy us." The room erupted in applause. Yet for Duncan, the most powerful moment came afterward, when a young man approached with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Because of you, I'm going to tell someone what happened to me." It was then Duncan understood. His story was no longer a chain. It was a key. Still, he was careful. He turned down offers that felt exploitative. He resisted the pressure to be a perpetual spokesperson, choosing instead to speak when it mattered most. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in impact. And slowly, advocacy began to reshape not only how the world saw him, but how he saw himself. He was no longer just the boy who had been silenced. He was a man who had broken silence, and in doing so, given others permission to do the same. Duncan stands at a crossroads. The shadows of his past still linger, but they no longer define him. He is learning to live with scars not as shame, but as strength. His voice has become more than a personal weapon. It is now part of a collective fight for truth, protection, and justice. And though advocacy carries weight, Duncan carries something greater: purpose. Freedom is a strange thing. For Duncan, it did not arrive all at once after Clifford's sentencing. It came in fragments, in ordinary moments that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. The first time he laughed without guilt. The first time he woke from sleep without a nightmare. The first time he looked in the mirror and saw not a broken boy, but a man reclaiming his life. These were victories, small but profound. For so long, Duncan had believed he was destined for shadow, doomed to live as a reflection of what had been done to him. Now, slowly, he was learning that life could be more. He began pursuing things that once felt impossible. He looked into career opportunities, not just jobs to survive, but paths that gave him purpose. He volunteered with organizations supporting children at risk, lending his voice to campaigns for stronger protections. Each act of service reinforced a truth he was still learning to believe. His past was not wasted if it could fuel change. Friendships deepened too. The more honest he became, the more authentic his relationships grew. No longer bound by secrecy, he could finally connect without fear. And through those connections, he discovered something he thought he had lost forever: trust. Love, however, was more complicated. The thought of intimacy frightened him. For years, closeness had been corrupted, twisted by Clifford's betrayal. How could he ever allow himself to be vulnerable again? How could he let someone see the scars and still believe himself worthy of love? But in time, he did meet people who saw beyond the past. Relationships weren't always easy. Some ended when the weight of trauma became too heavy. Others faltered because Duncan was still learning to let someone in. But each attempt chipped away at the belief that he was unlovable. Each step into intimacy reminded him that abuse had taken much, but it had not taken everything. He still had the capacity to love and to be loved. Forgiveness was another challenge. People often asked him if he could forgive Clifford. Some framed it as a moral question, others as a step toward healing. Duncan wrestled with it privately for years. He came to understand that forgiveness, for him, wasn't about excusing or reconciling. It was about release. Carrying hate only tethered him to Clifford's shadow. Letting go didn't mean condoning the crimes. It meant refusing to let them poison his present. Forgiveness, he realized, was less about Clifford and more about himself. It was about choosing freedom over bitterness. With each passing year, Duncan grew into a life he had never imagined possible. He still spoke at events, still advocated when his voice was needed, but he also allowed himself to simply live. Cooking dinners, traveling, enjoying music, sharing laughter with friends. These were not small things. They were radical acts of reclamation. Every joy he allowed himself was a defiance of the man who tried to destroy him. And through it all, Duncan's philosophy crystallized. Scars are not signs of weakness. They are evidence of survival. They are proof that pain does not have the final word. He carried that truth with him into every room he entered, every story he told, every life he touched. And in doing so, he built a legacy far greater than Clifford's shadow. A legacy of resilience, courage, and hope. By the time Duncan had begun to rebuild his personal life, his voice had already traveled further than he ever expected. What began as testimony in a courtroom had grown into a presence in conferences, schools, media, and survivor networks across the country. He never set out to become a figurehead, but his story carried weight and people listened. And with listening came responsibility. At first, Duncan wondered if advocacy was truly his path. He feared becoming trapped in his own narrative, defined forever by the worst thing that had happened to him. Yet as the years passed, he realized that advocacy was not about living in the past. It was about protecting the future. When he spoke to social workers, he reminded them of the cost of disbelief. When he addressed lawmakers, he urged them to strengthen protections for vulnerable children. When he spoke in schools, he told young people that silence should never be their burden. Each audience was different, but the message was the same. Listen, believe, protect. His influence grew not because he sought attention, but because his words rang with authenticity. He did not lecture from a podium of theory. He spoke from the raw reality of lived experience. People felt the truth in his voice. The weight of scars carried into strength. And yet, visibility carried challenges. The media often reduced him to headlines: son who exposed father's crimes, or survivor speaks out. These were true but incomplete. They flattened his life into a single identity. Duncan learned to navigate that reality. He couldn't control every headline, but he could control his own voice. And when he stood on stage or sat in front of a microphone, he insisted on nuance. He was not just a survivor. He was a man, a human being, a voice for change. One of the most difficult lessons he shared publicly was that justice, though vital, was never enough on its own. Clifford's imprisonment had brought accountability, but it had not erased trauma. The system could punish, but it could not heal. That, Duncan argued, was why prevention mattered more than reaction. Protecting children meant creating a culture where abuse could not hide, where secrecy was shattered by vigilance, where silence was broken by belief. It was not enough to respond after the fact. Society had to intervene before lives were scarred. These messages resonated. Organizations began inviting him not only to share his story, but to advise on policy, to contribute to educational programs, to help shape strategies for safeguarding children. His lived experience became a lens through which institutions re-examined their blind spots. But Duncan never let himself forget the personal amid the political. For him, advocacy was not about statistics or policies alone. It was about faces. The boy who wrote to him saying he had found courage. The woman who thanked him for reminding her she wasn't alone. The countless survivors who carried invisible battles. Every speech, every appearance, every letter reminded him why he spoke. Not for recognition, but for them. Duncan stands in a new chapter of his life, not only as a survivor reclaiming his future, but as an advocate shaping the futures of others. His journey has taken him from silence to testimony, from testimony to healing, and from healing to leadership. And while the scars of the past remain, they no longer define the limits of his life. They define the depth of his strength. Duncan had once believed his story was nothing but tragedy. Now it was something more. A force for justice, a call for vigilance, and a beacon for those still trapped in the dark. The more Duncan spoke out, the more invitations came. Conferences, schools, media requests, survivor networks, his calendar filled with commitments. For outsiders, it looked like he had fully stepped into his role as a public advocate. But behind closed doors, the reality was more complex. Because for every standing ovation, there was a night of restless sleep. For every letter of gratitude, there was a memory dragged back into the present. For every step forward, there was the risk of being pulled backward into old wounds. Advocacy was powerful, yes, but it was also exhausting. Duncan quickly realized that if he didn't set boundaries, his healing could unravel. He had already spent too many years being consumed by Clifford's shadow. He would not let his future be consumed by the expectations of the public. So he learned to say no, to step away when invitations came that didn't feel right, to take breaks from interviews when his spirit needed rest, to remind himself that he was more than his story, more than a symbol. I am not just what happened to me, he would remind himself. I am allowed to live. In that spirit, Duncan began cultivating an ordinary life, the kind of life he once thought impossible. He filled his home with music, letting melodies spill into rooms that once echoed with silence. He cooked meals not out of necessity, but out of pleasure. He traveled to places he had always dreamed of seeing, standing on unfamiliar streets where no one knew his name, where he was free to be anonymous. These small, everyday acts were not distractions. They were healing. Each moment of normalcy was a declaration. Clifford had taken enough. He would take no more. Still, there were times when the past intruded. Triggers came without warning. The sound of raised voices, the flicker of a news story, the way certain men carried themselves in public. When they hit hard, leaving Duncan shaken and questioning his progress. But instead of drowning in shame, he learned to recognize these moments as part of the process. Healing was not about erasing pain, but learning to live alongside it without letting it dominate. Resilience, he discovered, was not a finish line. It was a practice, something built day by day, choice by choice. Relationships remained a vital part of that practice. Duncan worked to nurture the bonds he had once neglected. He surrounded himself with people who understood boundaries, who didn't see him as fragile but respected when he needed space. And slowly, he allowed himself deeper forms of connection. Friendships rooted in trust, moments of intimacy that reminded him he was still capable of love. There were setbacks, of course. Some relationships faltered under the weight of his history. Others blossomed, proving that the scars of the past didn't have to dictate the possibility of closeness. Each attempt was a step toward rewriting the script of his life. Through it all, Duncan returned again and again to a simple truth. Healing was not about becoming who he might have been without the abuse. That boy was gone. Healing was about becoming someone new, someone forged in fire but not defined by it. He carried his scars openly now, not as wounds to be hidden, but as evidence of survival. They were part of his story, but they were not the whole of it. And in embracing that truth, Duncan found balance. The ability to step into the world as an advocate while still protecting his right to live privately, joyfully, freely. Duncan stands in a fragile but powerful space. A man living between past and future, between public mission and private life. He knows the work will never be finished. Trauma does not vanish, nor does advocacy ever truly end. But he also knows this. He has built a life that Clifford could not touch. A life that belongs to him. And in that knowledge, he finds not just survival, but peace. Time does not erase pain, but it changes its weight. Years after Clifford's conviction, Duncan found himself looking back with a perspective he never imagined possible. The memories remained, but they no longer held the same power. Where once they had swallowed entire days, now they flickered like distant storms, visible, threatening, but no longer devastating his every step. Scars had settled into his life, not as open wounds but as reminders. And with distance came clarity. In his early days of advocacy, Duncan spoke with urgency, as if every word had to be shouted into the world before silence reclaimed him. But as time passed, his voice changed. It grew steadier, calmer, more deliberate. He no longer felt the need to relive every detail for impact. Instead, he spoke from wisdom, from reflection, from a place where healing and pain could coexist without contradiction. People noticed the change. Survivors who had followed his journey said they felt reassurance in his tone, proof that the chaos of trauma could one day give way to stability. Policymakers and educators valued his perspective not just as testimony, but as guidance from someone who had lived through darkness and built a life beyond it. Duncan also began to see how cycles of abuse could only be broken through generational change. Clifford had been a product of silence, a man whose violence thrived in secrecy, shielded by stigma and disbelief. To prevent others like him, society had to dismantle those shields. He believed prevention began with education, teaching children about boundaries, giving them the language to describe harm, ensuring they knew they would be believed. It meant training teachers, doctors, social workers, and parents to recognize warning signs and act without hesitation. But it also required cultural change, a shift from suspicion toward empathy, from judgment toward protection. If a child speaks, listen, Duncan would say, even if it's uncomfortable, especially if it's uncomfortable. Outside of advocacy, his personal life continued to expand. He embraced the quiet victories of adulthood. Stable work, a circle of supportive friends, the chance to build routines that once seemed unreachable. Sometimes he looked at his life with disbelief, remembering the boy who once thought there was no future at all. In those moments, gratitude filled him, not gratitude for what he endured, but gratitude for the fact that he had endured, that he had survived long enough to see joy return. Yet he never romanticized survival. He knew the cost, the decades stolen, the innocence lost. That was why his mission carried weight. He was not interested in platitudes. He was interested in real, lasting change. And with time, he found himself less focused on telling his own story in detail and more on amplifying the voices of others. He mentored survivors who were just beginning to speak, guiding them through the same fears he had once faced. He collaborated with organizations to build platforms where many stories could be heard, not just his own. Duncan had once believed his greatest achievement was breaking his own silence. But as years passed, he realized his legacy was larger. It was in the silences he helped others break. Looking back, Duncan saw his life as a continuum. From a boy silenced by fear, to a man who found his voice, to an advocate who helped others find theirs. And through it all, one truth remained. Survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. Duncan reflects not with despair but with purpose. His scars have not vanished, but they have softened into wisdom. His voice, once trembling with pain, now carries the steady weight of resilience. And his vision is clear. A world where children are heard, where survivors are believed, and where silence is no longer the ground in which abuse takes root. For all the speeches Duncan gave, for all the audiences that applauded his courage, there remained one audience he struggled to convince: himself. Publicly, he was a survivor and advocate, a man who had turned trauma into purpose. But privately, he still wrestled with the residue of shame. Years of abuse had carved lies into his psyche. Lies about his worth, his lovability, his right to exist freely. Undoing those lies took longer than court battles or media campaigns. Took a lifetime of gentle persistence. Self-worth was not something Duncan simply discovered one day. It arrived slowly, in moments he almost overlooked. The way a friend laughed at his joke and meant it. The warmth of being trusted with someone else's vulnerability. The quiet satisfaction of creating something: music, writing, even a well-cooked meal, and realizing it had value simply because it was his. These moments taught him a truth that speeches could not. That worth was not something to be earned through survival or advocacy. It was inherent, untouched by Clifford's cruelty. Clifford had tried to convince him otherwise, but the man's power ended the day Duncan reclaimed his own voice. Love, however, was a more complicated terrain. Intimacy demanded trust, and trust had once been his greatest risk. For years, he kept people at arm's length, fearful that if they knew the full truth, they would recoil. Even when they didn't, he sometimes sabotaged closeness, convinced it was safer to retreat before rejection arrived. But over time, he learned that love was not about perfection or hiding scars. It was about honesty. He began to share his story not only on stages, but in whispers with people who mattered to him. And to his surprise, the honesty deepened connection rather than shattering it. Not every relationship lasted, but each one chipped away at the belief that he was unlovable. Each one reminded him that abuse had stolen years, but not his capacity to give or receive love. Perhaps the most profound shift came not in loving others, but in learning to love himself. For decades, mirrors had been cruel things. They reflected not just his appearance, but the weight of secrets and shame. But gradually, he began to see someone different staring back. Someone who had endured, who had spoken, who had rebuilt. The man in the mirror was not broken. He was whole, even if that wholeness included scars. Belonging was the final piece. For much of his life, Duncan felt like an outsider. Alienated from family by betrayal, from peers by secrecy, from himself by shame. But through survivor networks, friendships, and eventually chosen family, he discovered belonging was not about fitting perfectly into someone else's mold. It was about creating spaces where authenticity was welcomed. He no longer sought to erase his past in order to belong. Instead, he carried it honestly, and in doing so, he found others who accepted all of him. One evening, sitting with close friends, Duncan realized he felt something he had chased for years. Home. Not the physical kind, but the kind that lives in people, in self-acceptance, in the quiet assurance that you are exactly where you're meant to be. For a boy who once believed silence was his destiny, and for a man who once thought love was impossible, this moment was nothing short of extraordinary. Duncan's journey stands as a testament not just to survival, but to restoration. He has learned that worth is innate, that love is possible, and that belonging can be built even from the ruins of betrayal. His scars remain, but they no longer whisper lies. They tell the truth that he was hurt, yes, but also that he healed, that he endured, and that he emerged not defined by pain, but by resilience. Legacy is not something Duncan set out to build. In the beginning, he only wanted freedom. Freedom from Clifford's grip, from secrecy, from the endless weight of silence. But as years passed, and his voice carried further, Duncan began to see that his life had grown into something larger. His story had become a spark for others, and those sparks were becoming a fire. He often thought about the ripple effect. A single disclosure, a single act of courage, had not only put Clifford behind bars, but had also ignited conversations across communities. Teachers grew more vigilant. Survivors spoke more openly. Lawmakers debated policies with fresh urgency. Each ripple extended beyond his sight, touching lives he would never meet. And in that knowledge, Duncan found a deeper sense of purpose. His pain had not been for nothing. Still, he was careful not to romanticize it. Legacy, to him, was not about statues or speeches, not about being remembered as a symbol. It was about impact. Did children feel safer? Did survivors feel less alone? Did silence lose even a fraction of its grip? Those were the measures that mattered. He reflected often on the letters and conversations that had stayed with him. The boy who had written, "Because of you, I told my mom." The woman who whispered after a conference, "You put words to what I could never say." The social worker who promised to never again dismiss a child's fear as imagination. These were Duncan's true legacy, not grand accolades, but individual lives changed. Over time, his advocacy evolved. In the early years, it had been fueled by urgency, by the raw drive to shout the truth into every corner. Later, it matured into something steadier, focused on systems, prevention, and the long view of change. He began collaborating on training programs, shaping curricula, advising organizations. His role shifted from storyteller to strategist, from witness to builder. But no matter how technical the work became, he never lost sight of the heart. Protecting children, amplifying survivors, dismantling silence. Justice was another theme that weighed on him. Clifford's imprisonment had been necessary, even vital. But justice, Duncan realized, was more than punishment. True justice meant prevention. It meant a world where no child endured what he had endured. That vision was harder to achieve. It demanded not just laws, but culture. It demanded conversations at dinner tables, vigilance in classrooms, compassion in communities. It was slower, harder, less dramatic than courtroom trials, but Duncan believed it was the only justice that truly mattered. As he grew older, Duncan often wondered how he wanted to be remembered. Not as the boy whose father abused him, not as the survivor who spoke out. Those were true but incomplete. He wanted to be remembered as a man who transformed suffering into change. As someone who proved that trauma does not erase worth, that scars can hold strength, that silence is not unbreakable. He wanted his legacy to whisper into future generations. You are not alone. You are not to blame. And your voice matters. As installment 15 draws to a close, Duncan sits with the knowledge that while his scars will always remain, so too will his impact. The ripples continue, stretching far beyond him. And in that, he finds peace. His story began in silence, but his legacy will echo long after his voice is gone. Not as tragedy, but as proof of resilience, courage, and change. There comes a point, after years of surviving, speaking, and fighting, when silence begins to feel different. Not the suffocating silence of childhood, that heavy, dangerous quiet that shielded abuse, but a gentler silence, the kind found in long walks, quiet mornings, and moments of reflection. For Duncan, later life carried that kind of silence, and in it he found space to breathe. Looking back, he often marveled at the distance between the boy he had been and the man he had become. The boy had known only fear, secrecy, and despair. The man knew resilience, advocacy, and even joy. Yet the two were not separate. They lived side by side within him, like overlapping shadows. Sometimes he felt grief for that boy, mourning the innocence lost too soon. Other times he felt gratitude toward him, for holding on, for surviving long enough to let the man exist at all. It was a strange duality, grieving and thanking the same child, but it was the truth of survival. Ordinary joys took on extraordinary meaning in his later years. Cooking a meal for friends, hearing laughter fill his home, feeling the steady comfort of a partner's hand. These were not just moments. They were triumphs, victories won against years when he had believed such things were impossible. Travel also became a source of healing. Standing on cliffs overlooking vast oceans, wandering through cities where no one knew his story, Duncan felt freedom in anonymity. These moments reminded him that his life was not defined solely by trauma or advocacy. It was also defined by sunsets, music, friendship, and love. Of course, there were regrets. How could there not be? He grieved the years lost to silence. He wondered what kind of man he might have been if Clifford had never touched his life. He thought of opportunities missed, relationships strained, choices shaped by trauma's shadow. But with age came acceptance. Regret could not rewrite the past, but it could sharpen his appreciation for the present. Every joy felt more precious because it had been so hard-won. Every smile carried weight because it had once seemed out of reach. His reflections often circled back to peace. For a long time, he assumed peace meant forgetting, erasing the past as if it had never happened. But he came to see peace differently. Peace was not the absence of memory. It was the absence of domination. It was when the past no longer dictated the terms of his present. It was when he could sit with his scars and feel not bitterness, but calm. Peace, he realized, was not given. It was built day by day, choice by choice. In his later life, Duncan also began mentoring younger advocates, guiding them through the pitfalls he had faced, the exhaustion of advocacy, the risks of re-traumatization, the temptation to let one's story eclipse one's entire identity. He told them, "You are more than what happened to you. Let your voice be part of your life, not the whole of it." Passing on that wisdom felt like closing a circle. He had once been the boy who needed guidance. Now he was the man offering it. Duncan sits in that gentler silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of peace. He is not defined by what he lost, but by what he built. A life of meaning, joy, and resilience. His journey has been long, marked by pain and triumph alike. But at last, He has arrived at something the boy inside him never believed was possible: contentment. After decades of surviving, healing, and speaking, Duncan began to articulate something deeper: a philosophy of survival. It wasn't something he had planned, nor a doctrine he intended to publish. It was simply the truths he had uncovered, polished by time and lived experience. He knew others might carry different lessons, but these were his. The first was simple, yet the hardest to believe: what happened to you is not who you are. For so long, Duncan felt consumed by Clifford's crimes, as though his entire identity had been written by someone else's violence. But slowly, he realized that trauma may shape a life, but it does not define its worth. Survivors are not broken versions of normal people. They are people whole in themselves, carrying scars that testify not to weakness, but to endurance. The second truth was about forgiveness. People often asked him if he had forgiven Clifford, as though that single act could close the book. Duncan's answer was never neat. Forgiveness, for him, wasn't about excusing or reconciling. It was about release. Holding on to rage keeps me bound to him, he would say. Letting it go isn't for his sake. It's for mine. Forgiveness, in Duncan's philosophy, was not about Clifford at all. It was about reclaiming the energy once consumed by bitterness and using it to build joy. The third truth was about strength. Society often portrayed survivors as fragile, forever marked by damage. Duncan rejected that idea. To endure what he endured and still choose life, still choose love, still choose to stand and speak. That was strength of the highest order. Strength, he believed, was not the absence of pain. It was the choice to keep moving, even when pain remained. Another lesson, perhaps the one he carried most urgently, was for families and communities. Believe children. He knew firsthand how silence thrived on disbelief, how predators exploited hesitation and denial. Every time a child was dismissed, the cycle deepened. Every time a community looked away, another life was scarred. Protection begins with listening, Duncan would insist. Even if the words are uncomfortable, especially if they're uncomfortable. This was not just his philosophy, it was his plea. Finally, Duncan came to define freedom in his own way. Freedom, for him, was not about erasing the past. It was about living fully despite it. It was laughing with friends, waking up without fear, holding someone he loved without flinching. It was the ability to shape his days by choice rather than trauma. Freedom was not forgetting. It was no longer being owned by memory. As Duncan shared these truths, he often reminded listeners that survival was not a straight line. There would be setbacks, dark days, moments of doubt. But survival was not about never falling. It was about continuing to rise. His philosophy was not a promise of easy healing. It was an invitation to possibility. Duncan's words stand not as a conclusion but as a compass. His philosophy of survival is a map for others walking the same difficult path. You are not what was done to you. Your strength is greater than you know. Forgiveness is for your freedom, not theirs. Children must always be believed. And peace is possible, not in forgetting, but in living fully. For years, Duncan's life had been defined by telling his story. At first, it was a weapon, a way to expose Clifford, to shatter silence, to seek justice. Later, it became a tool, something he used to teach, to advocate, to build awareness. But in quieter moments, Duncan admitted to himself that storytelling was also a burden. Because every time he told it, he relived it. He remembered the first time he stood on a stage and spoke about Clifford. His hands shook. His voice trembled. It felt like tearing open a wound in front of strangers. And when the applause came, it was jarring, as if survival itself had been turned into performance. With time, the trembling faded. His voice steadied, but the weight never disappeared. Sharing his past meant carrying it into every room, no matter how far he had come in private life. That paradox haunted him. His greatest healing came from breaking silence, but so did his greatest exhaustion. Still, Duncan never doubted the necessity of his choice. He had seen the difference it made. He had watched audiences shift uncomfortably at his words, only to leave determined to act. He had seen young survivors approach him, saying they no longer felt alone. He had received letters from parents, teachers, even police officers, admitting his story had changed how they listened, how they responded, how they protected. Every time he wondered if it was worth reopening the wound, he remembered those faces, those words, and the answer was always yes. But Duncan also wrestled with another truth. His story was not just his. It was bound up with others, with his family, with Clifford, with the communities who had failed to see the signs. Carrying it into the world meant carrying pieces of them, too. That responsibility weighed heavily. He knew some wished he would stay silent, that the past should remain buried. But silence had already done enough harm. He refused to let it win again. Truth belongs in the light, he would say, even if it makes people uncomfortable. In his later years, Duncan began to reflect not only on why he told his story, but on how he told it. He no longer needed to recount every graphic detail. Instead, he focused on meaning, on lessons, on the humanity beneath the horror. He realized that storytelling was not about shock. It was about connection. People don't need to know every scar, he explained once. They need to know scars can heal. That shift allowed him to carry the story without being consumed by it. He told it not to bleed, but to build. Looking ahead, Duncan knew one day his own voice would fade. He would grow old, he would step back, and others would take his place. But he hoped his story would continue to echo, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a testimony of survival and change. Because in the end, the story was never just about Clifford's cruelty. It was about resilience, truth, and the unbreakable will of a boy who found his voice. Duncan's reflections on storytelling leave us with a powerful reminder. Stories have weight, stories have power, and stories carry responsibility. His journey shows that while trauma can silence, storytelling can liberate, not only for the one who speaks, but for all who listen. And in that act of telling, silence loses its grip. When Duncan thought about resilience, he often resisted the way society romanticized it. People loved the image of the triumphant survivor, the broken child turned into a symbol of strength. But Duncan knew the truth was messy. Resilience wasn't a single victory. It was dozens of small choices made in the dark. The choice to endure one more night, to take one more step, to whisper one more truth when silence seemed safer. Resilience was not glamorous. It was gritty, imperfect, often invisible. And yet, it was the most powerful force he had ever known. Through his own survival, Duncan came to see resilience as a mirror of humanity itself. We are fragile, yes, but we are also stubborn in our will to live, to heal, to hope. The same capacity that allows us to feel deep pain also allows us to feel deep joy. The same vulnerability that makes us hurt is the same vulnerability that makes us love. For Duncan, that paradox was not a weakness. It was the essence of being human. He often spoke about courage, too. People assumed courage meant testifying in court or standing on a stage or confronting Clifford. And yes, those were acts of courage. But Duncan believed the quiet acts were just as brave. The child who whispered their truth for the first time. The adult survivor who went to therapy despite fear. The parent who listened instead of dismissing. These, he insisted, were acts of courage that changed the world just as surely as headlines. As his reflections deepened, Duncan also began to envision the kind of world resilience could help build. Not just for survivors, but for everyone. A world where compassion replaced suspicion. A world where communities chose listening over denial. A world where silence no longer gave predators power. He believed it was possible, not because the world was perfect, but because people were capable of growth. He had seen change firsthand, in himself, in others, in society inching forward. If survival had taught him anything, it was that healing is never out of reach. Toward the end of his life, Duncan was often asked what message he most wanted to leave behind. His answer rarely changed. Your scars are not your weakness. They are the proof of your survival. They show not only what you endured, but what you overcame. If there is one thing I want you to carry, it's this. No matter what silence has tried to steal, your voice still matters. And your life is still yours. Duncan's reflections crystallize into something larger than his own story. His journey reveals not only the resilience of one man, but the resilience of humanity itself. Fragile yet unbreakable, scarred yet strong, capable of both immense suffering and immense love. The message is clear. Survival is not the end. It is the beginning of transformation. Every story has a beginning. Duncan's began in silence. A childhood shaped by fear, betrayal, and shadows too heavy for any boy to carry. But every story also has an ending. And Duncan's did not end in silence. It ended in voice, in resilience, in a life reclaimed. Looking back, his journey was never neat. It was jagged, marked by setbacks and triumphs, grief and joy, despair and hope. For years, he stumbled through darkness. For decades, he wrestled with scars. But slowly, step by step, he built something extraordinary. A life not defined by trauma, but by transformation. Clifford's cruelty had once seemed to dictate Duncan's destiny. Yet in the end, Clifford was not the author of this story. Duncan was, and with every act of survival, with every truth spoken, with every moment of love embraced, Duncan rewrote the narrative. He turned silence into speech. He turned pain into purpose. He turned wounds into wisdom. His life stands as proof that survival is not just possible, but powerful. That scars do not mark the end of beauty, but the beginning of strength. That even in the aftermath of cruelty, joy can be rediscovered, love can be trusted, and peace can be built. In his final reflections, Duncan often returned to one truth: no one should ever walk this path alone. His hope was not only for survivors, but for all of us, that we might create a world where silence no longer shelters abuse, where compassion outweighs denial, where every child is believed. Change begins with listening, he would remind us, and listening can save lives. And so, as his voice fades from the stage and into memory, the echo remains. The boy who once believed his life was ruined became the man who proved survival could shine brighter than suffering. His journey reminds us that while cruelty may leave scars, it cannot erase the human will to endure, to rise, to live. Duncan's story ends not with despair, but with legacy. His scars whisper of pain, yes, but also of resilience. His silence gave way to truth. His truth gave way to change. And in that change, he leaves behind a message for generations yet to come. You are not what was done to you. Your voice matters. And your life, every scar, every struggle, every triumph, is still your own. As the final words settle, the silence that follows is no longer suffocating. It is a silence of peace, of closure, of hope. The story is complete, but its echo continues.